Tonight we walk beside a river older than memory, where darkness settles softly over black water, and the first stars begin trembling above the reeds. The air smells of wet earth and river mud. Somewhere beyond the banks, frogs call through the warm evening and insects drift lazily through torch smoke. You stand at the edge of the Nile long before the pyramids exist, long before famous kings carve their names into stone, and already the river feels eternal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while the night settles around us, you might share your location, your local time, and what part of history you enjoy most. There is something comforting about knowing who else is awake beneath distant skies. Now dim the lights. The Nile moves slowly beside you. Not silent, never silent. Water presses gently against reeds and carries the faint smell of fish mud and living plants. Every year, the river floods these banks, spreading dark, fertile soil across the valley. Without those floods, this land would be almost impossible to survive. Beyond the narrow green edges waits open desert, dry stone, blinding heat. A world that does not forgive mistakes. But here beside the water, life gathers. You arrive in Egypt nearly 5,000 years ago, when villages still cling cautiously to the riverbanks. Mud brick homes bake beneath the sun. Children run barefoot through damp soil. Fishermen pull nets from shallow water, while women grind grain with worn stone tools. Nothing about this world feels grand yet. No colossal monuments rise above the horizon. No golden tombs glitter underground. History often begins quietly like this, with ordinary people trying to eat before the flood season changes again. The mornings arrive cool and pale. Mist hovers over the Nile, while workers carry baskets of barley and emmer wheat towards storage pits. The smell of baking bread drifts through the village before sunrise. Dogs wander between houses hoping for scraps. You hear coughing from smoky hearth fires. Someone laughs nearby, someone else argues over missing tools. The humanity of ancient Egypt appears long before its greatness does. That part is easy to forget. Later generations imagine Egypt as stone statues and silent tombs, but for most people life feels smaller and more immediate. A cracked water jar matters more than philosophy. A healthy goat matters more than immortality. Parents worry about sick children. Farmers study clouds nervously. Old men complain about taxes even before formal kingdoms fully emerge. Human habits survive every century remarkably intact, and still something larger slowly begins forming here. The Nile creates unusual stability. Unlike many rivers, its floods arrive with remarkable rhythm. The waters rise during summer and retreat months later, leaving rich black soil behind. Villages learn to cooperate around irrigation and planting cycles. Small communities become linked by shared dependence on the river's moods. You start noticing boats travelling farther north and south. Traders carry pottery, fish, copper tools, beads, and carved ivory ornaments between settlements. Ideas travel too. Religious symbols appear repeatedly across distant villages. Certain leaders gain influence beyond their local homes. Power gathers gradually like water collecting behind a dam. In the southern lands of Upper Egypt, ambitious rulers begin absorbing neighbouring communities. They wear white crowns shaped like tall bowling pins. Farther north in the Nile Delta, rival rulers wear low red crowns. The river valley is becoming political now. Borders matter. Armies begin forming, though they still look rough and uncertain compared to later ages. You can almost feel the shape of a kingdom trying to emerge from scattered human need. At night, elders speak quietly beside fires, while beer foams thick inside clay cups. Stories drift through the darkness about falcon gods watching from the sky, about spirits hiding in desert winds, about the strange journey waiting after death. Religion here does not feel separate from daily life. It sits inside every flood, every harvest, every birth. The gods are not distant. They are weather, soil, hunger, fertility. One ruler eventually rises above the others. Historians still debate details because records from this age remain fragmented and difficult. Some call him Nama. Others connect him with a legendary king named Menes. The truth hides somewhere inside surviving carvings and broken stone fragments. But one fact becomes clear. Upper and Lower Egypt unites beneath a single ruler. The moment changes everything. You stand near a ceremonial gathering where banners flap in dry wind and servants carry offerings toward a newly powerful king. Dust rises around marching feet. The smell of sweat and livestock hangs beneath the afternoon heat. Musicians strike drums while officials carefully observe one another with guarded expressions. No one here realizes they are watching the birth of one of history's longest-lasting civilizations. That's another strange thing about history. Most people living inside major turning points have no idea. The new kingdom needs symbols strong enough to hold distant territories together. The king becomes more than political leader. He becomes sacred. Not fully a god, perhaps not yet in the way later pharaohs claim, but something dangerously close. His authority now reaches beyond simple force. He represents cosmic balance itself. Order against chaos. The Egyptians will later call this divine harmony Ma'at, truth, balance, stability, proper order. Without it, the world risked collapse. Crops fail, floods disappear, society fractures. The king's duty is not merely governing people. He must hold reality together. Quite a stressful occupation when you think about it. As generations pass, royal officials begin recording harvests, labour obligations and religious ceremonies. Early hieroglyphs appear scratched into tags, jars and ceremonial palettes. Writing grows from administration as much as imagination. Someone must count grain. Someone must record tribute. Civilization often begins with exhausted accountants. You watch scribes crouched carefully beside baskets of goods, reed brushes moving across surfaces with remarkable concentration. Ink stains their fingers. Their backs ache constantly. Literacy remains rare and powerful. Words themselves seem magical because they preserve voices against time. Already Egypt understands something terrifying about death. Human beings disappear quickly, names vanish, bodies decay, memories fade within generations. But writing can resist oblivion. The desert evening cools slowly around you now. Workers return home carrying baskets and fishing spears. The western horizon burns orange beyond distant dunes. Somewhere a baby cries briefly before settling again. Smoke rises from cooking fires into darkening air. And beside all this ordinary life, the kingdom continues hardening into permanence. Royal tombs grow larger. Ceremonies become more elaborate. Sacred symbols spread across the river valley. Egypt is still young, still uncertain, but its foundations are settling deep into the earth beside the Nile. You can feel future centuries waiting quietly ahead. The pyramids are still far away. But the idea behind them has already begun. Morning arrives harsh and white across the Nile Valley. Heat already shimmers above the ground before the sun fully clears the horizon. You walk beside labourers moving toward a construction site through blowing dust, and at first the place does not look extraordinary. It looks noisy, crowded, irritating even. Men shout over one another while donkeys bray impatiently beside sledges loaded with limestone blocks. Someone curses after smashing a thumb beneath a rope knot. Nearby bread ovens release the warm smell of grain and ash into the dry air. Then you look upward. Stone rises against the sky in impossible angles. Not yet the smooth pyramids later generations will imagine, but the first enormous experiments in permanence. Egypt has entered the Old Kingdom now, and its rulers no longer want simple tombs buried quietly beneath desert sand. They want monuments capable of defying death itself. You stand near Saqqara during the reign of King Djoser, where the architect Imhotep oversees a revolutionary idea. Instead of building a flat mastaba tomb from mud brick, workers stack stone layers upward toward heaven. The step pyramid grows tier by tier beneath relentless sunlight, and people stare at it with the same disbelief later generations reserve for cathedrals or rockets. Because no civilization has attempted anything like this before. The stone smells dusty and hot beneath your fingertips. Copper tools scrape endlessly across limestone. Sledges groan against packed earth while teams of workers pull together in rhythm. Their shoulders shine with sweat. Their hands blister and split. Water carriers move constantly between crews because dehydration can quietly kill a man before noon. Yet the atmosphere feels strangely organised. Popular imagination often pictures pyramid builders as slaves whipped mercilessly beneath the desert's sun. The truth appears more complicated and more human. Archaeological evidence suggests many labourers are skilled workers, craftsmen and seasonal farmers recruited during flood, months when fields disappear underwater. They receive food shelter, beer, medical care, and social status connected to royal projects. Not luxury, certainly, their bodies will still break under the labour. But this is a society building something collectively, not merely through terror. You sit one evening beside exhausted workers sharing thick bread onions and cloudy beer after sunset. Their clothes smell of sweat and limestone dust. One man rubs aching knees while another jokes darkly about dying before the pyramid finishes. Laughter spreads quietly through the group. Human beings remain wonderfully consistent across 5,000 years. Someone always complains about management. The pharaoh overseeing this age no longer appears merely royal. He stands at the centre of cosmic order itself. His survival after death matters to the stability of Egypt. If the king joins the gods successfully, the Nile will continue flooding properly. Harvests will return, society will endure. That belief justifies astonishing effort. You begin noticing how deeply religion shapes every corner of Egyptian life. Priests move through temple courtyards carrying incense and offerings. Sacred rituals accompany construction projects. Hieroglyphs carved into walls become prayers as much as decoration. The boundary between practical labour and spiritual duty barely exists. Even architecture feels religious. The pyramids themselves reflect sunlight with blinding brilliance when newly completed. Smooth white casing stones cover their outer surfaces, polished enough to glow across the desert. Imagine approaching Giza in this era by boat along the Nile. 3 gigantic geometric mountains shine above the western horizon, like frozen rays of sun. It must have felt unreal. By the time Pharaoh Khufu begins constructing the Great Pyramid at Giza, Egypt commands enormous resources. Quarries operate continuously. Boats carry granite from Aswan. Administrators track supplies through dense records. Bakers, brewers, physicians, priests and labour supervisors all support the project. An empire of logistics rises beside the monument itself, and beneath the grandeur lives ordinary exhaustion. You walk through workers' settlements where cramped sleeping quarters smell of wet clay, stale beer, and human bodies packed closely together. Medical workers treat crushed fingers and infected cuts. Skeletons discovered here centuries later reveal arthritis, spinal injuries, and healed fractures from years of labour. History remembers kings easily. It remembers labourers only when archaeologists uncover their bones. At night, though, the mood softens. The desert cools surprisingly fast after sunset. Workers sit outside sharing stories beneath clear skies dense with stars. Someone plays a simple flute melody that drifts gently through the darkness. A father carves a small toy from scrapwood for his son. Another man quietly worries about crops back home after unusually low floodwaters. The pyramid waits above them, enormous and unfinished. Immortality requires tremendous maintenance. You follow priests deeper into funerary rituals now shaping Egyptian identity. Death here is not viewed as disappearance. It is transition. Survival depends on preparation. Bodies must remain preserved because the soul requires recognition after death. Tombs contain food, furniture, tools, cosmetics, jewellery, and carved servants intended for the next world. The Egyptians approach eternity with remarkable practicality. If you might need sandals after death, better pack them carefully. Mummification develops slowly across these centuries. Early preservation methods remain imperfect, but the intention grows increasingly sophisticated. Priests remove organs, dry bodies with natron salt, and wrap the dead carefully in linen. Resin and incense fill preparation chambers with sharp, heavy smells. Mourning families wait nearby while the professional mourners cry publicly outside. Death becomes an industry as much as a spiritual mystery. Meanwhile, the kingdom prospers. Trade expands into Nubia, the Sinai, and the Levant. Fine goods arrive from distant regions. Officials decorate tombs with scenes of fishing, feasting, music, and agriculture because Egyptians want continuity after death. They wish eternity to resemble familiar comforts. There is something deeply touching about that. No matter how grand civilizations become, people still hope the next world contains good meals and familiar company. But beneath Egypt's confidence, cracks already exist. Huge monuments demand huge resources. Royal authority grows increasingly centralized. Provincial governors gain wealth and influence over time. Climate patterns begin shifting unpredictably. Some historians believe lower Nile floods contribute gradually to economic strain near the end of the Old Kingdom. The certainty sustaining pyramid culture weakens slowly. You notice tension in administrative centers now. Grain records matter more urgently. Local officials compete quietly for influence. Priests accumulate land and power around major temples. The machinery of the kingdom grows heavier each generation, and heavy things eventually strain under their own weight. Still standing before the Great Pyramid newly completed, none of that feels obvious yet. The monument dominates everything. Its limestone surface gleams beneath afternoon sunlight so brightly you almost cannot look directly at it. Workers appear ant-like beside its immense base. The desert wind brushes softly against stone edges sharp enough to define shadows perfectly. Khufu himself is long dead by now, sealed somewhere deep inside the structure. Yet his presence lingers everywhere. In the geometry, in the labour, in the silhouette surrounding the chambers hidden within millions of stone blocks. You stand there as evening approaches and shadows stretch slowly across the plateau. A warm wind carries sand gently against your skin. Nearby, a worker coughs from limestone dust lodged permanently in his lungs. And above all of you rises humanity's oldest surviving obsession. The desperate hope that something of us might last forever. The silence arrives gradually, not all at once. Civilizations rarely collapse with dramatic final speeches and falling statues. More often they weaken through small disappointments repeated over generations. A poor harvest, delayed wages, officials growing careless, governors becoming ambitious, people noticing quietly at first that the promises of stability no longer feel entirely convincing. You feel it now, moving through Egypt like dry wind across empty fields. The age of pyramid builders is fading. The Nile still floods, but not always high enough. Some years the waters arrive thin and disappointing, leaving cracked soil where rich black mud should spread. Farmers walk their fields with worried expressions. Granaries no longer feel comfortably full. Bread grows more expensive in local markets. Hungry people become impatient quickly. Even the air seems different. Dust lingers longer over the valley. The desert presses closer against the edges of cultivated land. You smell dry earth instead of wet riverbank some mornings, and older villagers mutter uneasily about neglected gods or weakened kings. Perhaps both. The pharaohs of the late Old Kingdom continue presenting themselves as divine guardians of order, but authority now feels stretched thin across the kingdom. Powerful regional governors called nomarchs control increasing wealth, far from the royal court. Their tombs grow larger. Their confidence grows sharper. Egypt is becoming local again. You travel north toward Memphis, where royal administrators once managed enormous state projects with impressive precision. The city still bustles with activity, yet something beneath the surface feels strained. Temple officials argue quietly over grain deliveries. Scribes revise tax records repeatedly. Workers complain about missed rations. A kingdom built on confidence struggles when confidence disappears. Inside crowded workshops, craftsmen continue carving statues and painting tomb walls, though commissions arrive less regularly now. One sculptor pauses while smoothing limestone beneath his chisel. Fine white dust covers his arms and beard. He glances toward the palace district before lowering his voice. "The old kings built for eternity," he mutters. "Now everyone builds for themselves." Then he returns to work quickly, as though the walls themselves might report him. That tension settles everywhere. The Great Pyramids still dominate the western horizon, immense and immovable beneath the sun. But they belong to another emotional world now. Their construction no longer inspires collective certainty. Instead, they feel almost haunting. Reminders of stronger rulers and fuller granaries. Monuments outlive belief surprisingly often. You walk through villages where ordinary people adapt as best they can. Women knead dough carefully to stretch dwindling grain supplies. Fishermen spend longer hours along marshes chasing smaller catches. Children gather reeds for fuel beside shrinking irrigation canals. And always the Nile decides everything. When floodwaters fail repeatedly, fear spreads faster than officials can contain it. Some historians believe broader climate changes affected the region during this period, reducing rainfall far south where the Nile begins its long journey northward. The Egyptians themselves possessed no scientific explanation. They only know the river seems unreliable. That uncertainty touches religion deeply. If the king maintains cosmic balance, why does suffering increase? No comfortable answer arrives. You spend one evening inside a provincial household belonging to a local governor whose influence now rivals distant royalty. Oil lamps flicker against painted walls while servants pour beer into shallow cups. The room smells faintly of roasted duck and incense. Musicians play softly in the corner, yet conversation remains tense. The governor speaks politely about loyalty to the crown while carefully avoiding direct praise for the pharaoh. His wife exchanges cautious glances with guests whenever politics emerges. Everyone senses the centre weakening, though nobody wishes to say it openly. Power changes the emotional atmosphere of entire societies. People become careful with words. Farther south, conditions worsen. Tomb inscriptions from this age describe famine, disorder, and desperate violence. Some accounts may exaggerate for political purposes later, but enough evidence survives to reveal genuine instability. Communities raid one another for food. Burials grow simpler. Local conflicts intensify. One ancient text speaks bitterly of social collapse, describing servants behaving like masters and hungry people robbing tombs. Historians debate how literally these writings should be read. Egyptians often use dramatic language to describe disorder. Still, the emotional truth feels unmistakable. The old certainty has broken. You pass through settlements where silence hangs heavily after sunset. Cooking fires burn smaller now. People eat slowly, carefully. An elderly farmer studies the dark riverbank while rubbing cracked hands together. "When I was young," he says quietly, "the floods reached those stones." He points far beyond the current waterline. Then he says nothing else. That small human forward moment carries more weight than royal inscriptions ever could. The first intermediate period begins unfolding across Egypt. Rival rulers compete for territory while the kingdom fragments politically. Different regions claim legitimacy. Armies march beneath competing banners. Messengers ride constantly between nervous officials, and ordinary people continue trying to survive inside forces much larger than themselves. You stand beside a dusty road one afternoon as soldiers move northward, carrying spears and rough shields. Their sandals scrape dry earth in tired rhythm. Most look anxious rather than heroic. One young recruit cannot stop adjusting his grip nervously. Another keeps touching a small amulet hanging beneath his tunic. No one marches confidently towards civil war. The desert wind rises suddenly, carrying grit through the air. Men squint against it while banners snap sharply overhead. Somewhere nearby a donkey screams irritably. Then the column disappears into haze. At times like this, Egypt feels strangely mortal. For centuries, the civilization appeared almost eternal beside the predictable river and massive pyramids. Now you understand how fragile even great kingdoms remain beneath the surface. Stability requires constant maintenance, trust, cooperation, shared belief. Once those weakened stone monuments alone cannot save a society. Yet even here, amid uncertainty, life continues stubbornly. Children still chase each other beside canals. Lovers still meet privately after dark. Bakers still rise before dawn. Priests still light incense before sacred statues. Human continuity survives political collapse more often than history books admit. And slowly, quietly, new leaders begin imagining restoration. In the southern city of Thebes, ambitious rulers gather strength. They present themselves not merely as conquerors, but as healers of a wounded kingdom. Men who can restore balance. Men who can reunite the two lands beneath proper order once again. You hear their names spoken more frequently now in marketplaces and temple courtyards. Hope returns carefully at first. Like the Nile after years of disappointing floods, the river feels calmer again. Not peaceful exactly. Egypt has seen too much uncertainty for innocence now. But as your boat moves south toward Thebes beneath pale morning light, you sense a kingdom trying carefully to steady itself after generations of strain. The Nile glimmers silver beside thick banks of papyrus. Farmers bend over green fields once more. Fishing nets dry on wooden poles beside villages, waking sun slowly into day. The smell of wet soil returns to the air. That alone feels hopeful. The rulers of Thebes rise gradually from provincial strength into national authority. They are not dreamers wandering toward destiny beneath heroic music. They are practical men shaped by civil conflict. Men who understand how quickly order collapses when power weakens too far from local realities. And so they rebuild Egypt differently. You arrive in Thebes while workers crowd narrow streets carrying baskets of grain, clay jars, and fresh-cut reeds. The city hums with deliberate energy. Donkeys push through busy markets while scribes hurry between administrative compounds clutching rolls of papyrus. Temple walls gleam beneath newly painted plaster. Everything smells alive again. Bread ovens, livestock, river water, human sweat. The Middle Kingdom has begun. King Mentuhotep II reunifies Egypt after defeating rival northern rulers, ending the long fragmentation of the First Intermediate Period. His victory feels military certainly, but also emotional. Egypt wants coherence again. People crave predictability after generations of instability. That desire gives rulers enormous power. You stand among crowds during a religious procession, where priests carry sacred images through the streets beneath drifting incense smoke. Musicians beat drums in slow rhythm while officials distribute food offerings to gathered families. Children sit on their father's shoulders trying to see above the crowd. The mood surprises you. Not ecstatic, relieved. Relief may be one of history's most underestimated emotions. The new rulers understand symbolism deeply. They restore temples, repair irrigation systems, expand bureaucracy. Royal inscriptions speak constantly about restoring Ma'at, the sacred balance damaged during years of division. Order becomes the kingdom's central obsession, and quietly, almost invisibly, administration becomes more sophisticated than ever before. You spend time inside the government offices where scribes work shoulder to shoulder, beneath open windows allowing faint river breezes inside. Reed brushes scratch endlessly across papyrus. Ink stains fingers black and red. Records pile high beside sweating officials calculating taxes, labour obligations and grain storage levels. No civilization survives long without paperwork. Ancient Egypt learns this thoroughly. The pharaoh remains sacred, but Middle Kingdom rulers present themselves somewhat differently from the distant god-kings of the Pyramid Age. They still possess divine authority, yet they also emphasize responsibility, wisdom, stewardship. Some texts portray kings staying awake at night worrying about justice and proper governance. Whether sincere or political theatre hardly matters now. The image affects people. You notice growing literary culture during this period too. Stories, instructions, and reflective texts circulate among educated elites. One famous work advises young men to become scribes because physical labour destroys the body while literacy brings status and comfort. A remarkably timeless career recommendation. You watch students practicing hieroglyphs carefully beneath the stern eyes of instructors carrying thin wooden rods for encouragement. The classroom smells of dust, ink, and nervous concentration. One boy mouths symbols silently while copying them onto rough surfaces. Another fights exhaustion after waking before sunrise. Education here feels precious because so few receive it. Most Egyptians still live hard physical lives tied closely to agriculture. During flood seasons, villages adapt around rising waters. During harvests, entire families work long hours beneath intense sun, gathering grain before spoilage or theft can occur. Linen clothing sticks damply against skin. Flies gather everywhere. Backs ache constantly. Yet compared to the recent chaos, many people experience this era as steel. That stability allows beauty to flourish again. You walk through workshops where artisans carve delicate jewellery from gold and semi-precious stone. Sculptors produce statues with remarkable emotional subtlety compared to earlier rigid forms. Faces appear thoughtful now, human. Even royal portraits reveal traces of weariness and age. Perhaps Egypt has matured emotionally after surviving collapse. The Nile remains at the centre of everything. You spend one evening aboard a riverboat drifting north beneath enormous stars while marsh birds cry faintly across dark water. Sailors repair ropes by lamplight. Someone cooks fish over a small fire near the stern. The smell mixes with damp reeds and river mud. A young crewman speaks quietly about his wife expecting their first child. He worries about providing enough grain if floodwaters disappoint next year. History continues through small anxieties like these. Meanwhile, Egypt expands southward into Nubia seeking gold resources and security. Fortresses rise along frontier regions. Soldiers patrol trade routes through dangerous desert territories. Military power grows increasingly professional during this period. You visit one frontier fortress where hot desert wind rattles wooden gates throughout the night. Soldiers sit cleaning weapons beside torchlight while officers study reports from distant patrols. The mood feels lonely more than glorious. One guard admits he misses the smell of river fields back home. Empires always rely heavily on homesick young men. Trade also stretches farther now. Egyptian expeditions travel toward Punt, likely somewhere along the Red Sea region, bringing back incense, exotic animals, ivory and rare woods. Merchants return with astonishing stories about distant coasts and unfamiliar peoples. For ordinary Egyptians, the world feels larger than before, and still beneath prosperity, tensions quietly gather again. Royal power depends heavily on capable rulers. Strong kings maintain central authority through competence and careful administration. Weak kings invite problems quickly. The system remains vulnerable because so much balance rests upon one figure at the top. Human institutions rarely become as permanent as they appear. You begin noticing subtle unease late in the Middle Kingdom. Court politics sharpen. Succession questions grow sensitive. Some provincial elites accumulate significant wealth once more. Foreign groups move increasingly through Egypt's eastern borders seeking trade work or settlement. Most arrive peacefully. History becomes dangerous when societies stop noticing gradual change. One rainy evening, unusually cool for the Nile Valley, you shelter inside a modest household while water taps softly against the roof. A grandmother tells children stories about earlier times of famine and division. The younger ones listen wide-eyed beside flickering oil lamps. Egypt survived, she says finally. The statement sounds comforting, but also cautious, because memory remains long here. The pyramids still stand beyond the horizon. Ancient kings still gaze blindly westward from weathered statues. Egypt has rebuilt itself impressively after collapse. Yet survival has taught the kingdom something important. Nothing lasts automatically, not even along the eternal Nile. The horses arrive before the fear fully settles in. At first, they are stories carried along trade routes and whispered beside harbour docks. Foreigners in the eastern delta speak of fast-moving chariots, strange composite bows and war leaders from beyond the Sinai. Most Egyptians barely understand what those things mean. Horses remain rare here, chariots almost unimaginable. The Nile Valley still trusts its old rhythms. But history is already approaching through the desert. You travel north into the delta, where the river branches into wide marshlands thick with reeds and insects. The air feels heavier here, damp and buzzing beneath pale skies. Villages sit low against the water while fishing boats drift through narrow channels. Traders move constantly between Egypt and neighbouring lands, carrying timber, wine, copper oils, and gossip. Foreign accents no longer sound unusual. That matters more than anyone realises. Over generations, migrants from Western Asia settle gradually in northern Egypt. Some arrive peacefully seeking work and trade opportunities during periods of Egyptian weakness. Others bring families and establish communities along the delta. Egyptian officials tolerate much of this movement because trade enriches everyone involved. Empires often absorb outsiders comfortably right until the moment they cannot. You sit inside a crowded riverside tavern one humid evening listening to conversations overlap beneath drifting lamp smoke. Sailors smell of fish sweat and wet rope. Merchants argue over cargo prices while musicians pluck tired melodies in the corner. At one table, Egyptian labourers exchange uneasy glances toward a group of foreign traders speaking another language. They keep arriving, one man mutters quietly. The other shrugs without conviction. People always arrive. Yes, they do. Then circumstances change. The central authority of the Middle Kingdom weakens over time through internal instability and uncertain succession. Regional power fractures again. Egypt becomes vulnerable precisely when new military technologies spread across the eastern Mediterranean. And vulnerability invites opportunity. The Hyksos emerge from this shifting world. Even their name carries ambiguity. Egyptians later describe them as rulers of foreign lands, though historians still debate exactly how sudden or organised their rise truly was. They are likely a mixed population from Western Asia, who gradually consolidate control in northern Egypt during political weakness. Later Egyptian accounts portray them dramatically as violent invaders descending upon helpless cities. Reality appears more complicated. Some communities probably experience abrupt conflict and destruction. Others may simply adapt gradually to new rulers already living among them. History rarely divides neatly between invasion and migration. Still, for Egyptians, the emotional impact feels enormous. Foreign kings now rule parts of the Nile Valley. You stand near the city of Avaris, the Hyksos capital in the delta, where marketplaces overflow with unfamiliar styles, imported pottery and mixed languages. The streets smell of livestock, cooking meat, river mud, and sea trade carried inland from distant coasts. This is not a wasteland of conquerors. It is a functioning multicultural city. Hyksos rulers adopt many Egyptian customs surprisingly quickly. They use Egyptian titles, worship local gods alongside their own deities, employ Egyptian scribes and administrators. Power adapts because ruling Egypt requires participation in Egyptian traditions. Yet difference remains visible everywhere. Their military strength unsettles Egyptian observers most deeply. Horses pull lightweight chariots through training grounds outside the city walls. Bronze weapons glint beneath harsh sunlight. Composite bows launch arrows farther and harder than traditional Egyptian equipment. You watch Egyptian soldiers observing these demonstrations with tight expressions. One older officer folds his arms uneasily. That changes battles, he says softly. He is right. Military innovation often feels unfair when first encountered. Farther south, native Egyptian rulers maintain control around Thebes. The kingdom effectively splits again between Hyksos north and Egyptian south. Tension settles across the Nile like approaching weather. Diplomacy continues outwardly, but distrust sharpens underneath. You travel between these divided worlds, watching ordinary people adapt carefully to uncertainty. Farmers still plant grain beside irrigation canals. Fishermen still mend nets. Children still chase dogs through dusty courtyards. Most people throughout history simply continue living while politics shifts above them. Yet identity begins hardening during this era. Egyptian rulers in Thebes increasingly define themselves against foreign domination. Court rhetoric emphasizes native tradition, sacred kingship, and restoring proper order. The Hyksos become symbols of humiliation as much as political rivals. National memory is forming now, and memory can become dangerous. One night you shelter inside a Theban household during a desert storm. Wind rattles shutters while sand whispers against mud brick walls. The family eats quietly by lamplight. Outside, thunder rolls faintly across distant hills. The father speaks bitterly about northern rulers. They sit in our palaces, he says. They command our river. His teenage son listens intensely. You can almost feel future wars beginning inside conversations like this. The Hyksos period changes Egypt profoundly despite later efforts to erase or condemn it. Egyptians adopt important military technologies from their rivals, including horse-drawn chariots and stronger weapons. Trade networks expand, cultural exchange deepens. Humiliation often teaches society quickly. Eventually, Theban rulers decide coexistence cannot continue. Conflict escalates through raids, border tensions, and open warfare. Pharaoh Seqenenre likely dies violently during these struggles. His mummy, discovered thousands of years later, shows terrible head wounds consistent with battle injuries. You imagine the aftermath. A dim chamber heavy with incense and blood. Shocked attendants whispering urgently. A royal family realizing compromise may no longer remain possible. War hardens across generations now. Kamose, successor to Seqenenre launches aggressive campaigns against the Hyksos. His inscriptions drip with anger and determination. He mocks foreign rulers occupying Egyptian land and presents himself as liberator. The emotional stakes have become existential. Then comes Ahmose, young, ambitious, relentless. You follow Egyptian armies northward through dusty roads, crowded with infantry archers, supply wagons, and newly adopted chariots. Soldiers march beneath fluttering banners, while officers shout commands through blowing sand. The smell of leather sweat, horse breath, and sharpened bronze fills the air. This no longer resembles the older Egypt of pyramid builders. This Egypt has learned war differently. Sieges grind slowly against fortified Hyksos cities. Accounts remain incomplete, but violence clearly scars the landscape. Families flee contested region. Crops burn, trade stalls. The struggle feels personal after generations of divided rule. When Ahmose finally drives the Hyksos from Egypt, celebration erupts across Thebes. But victory leaves something changed behind. Egypt no longer sees itself merely as a protected kingdom along the Nile. Foreign powers have occupied sacred land once before. They could return again. That fear will shape the next centuries completely. You stand beside the river as dawn spreads gold across the water. Soldiers returning south sing rough victory songs from crowded boats. Priests burn incense toward the brightening sky. Citizens gather cheering along the banks. And beneath the relief, beneath the pride, a new Egypt quietly emerges. An Egypt preparing not only to survive threats, but to become one. Egypt begins marching outward, not cautiously, not reluctantly. The memory of foreign rule still burns too deeply for that. The rulers of the new age believe safety depends on strength beyond their borders. Enemies must be confronted before they ever reach the Nile again. And so the kingdom becomes an empire. You feel the change immediately in Thebes. The city pulses with military energy now. Chariot wheels rattle through busy streets before sunrise. Bronze weapons clang inside workshops thick with furnace smoke. Young recruits crowd training grounds beside the river, while officers bark commands beneath the growing heat. The smell of horse sweat has become part of Egypt. That alone would have seemed astonishing centuries earlier. Amn, founder of the 18th dynasty, rebuilds royal authority aggressively after expelling the Hyksos. Temples rise again. Trade routes reopen. Nubia to the south falls under tighter Egyptian control. Wealth flows northward in gold, cattle, ivory, and captives. Victory feeds ambition quickly. You travel with a military convoy moving south toward Nubia through landscapes of hard stone and burning sunlight. Dust coats your skin by midday. The river narrows between cliffs while soldiers march beside supply boats hugging the shoreline. Men wrap linen around their heads against the heat. One young archer vomits quietly after drinking bad water. Empires are sustained through deeply unglamorous suffering. Still, morale remains high. Soldiers speak proudly about Egypt's growing strength. They admire the pharaoh not only as sacred ruler now, but as warrior. Military success becomes central to royal identity during the new kingdom, and war changes societies emotionally. You notice it in conversations first. Veterans describe foreign campaigns with rough excitement over shared meals. Children play mock battles beside canals. Artists carve scenes of conquered enemies into temple walls with increasing detail and enthusiasm. Violence becomes part of national mythology, yet beneath the triumph exists constant labour. Campaigns require food transport animals, weapons, scribes, healers, engineers, diplomats, and endless logistical coordination. You spend one humid evening inside a military records office where exhausted officials tally grain rations by lamplight. Papyrus sheets cover every surface. One scribe rubs sore eyes and mutters, "The army eats more than locusts." His colleague laughs weakly without looking up. Conquest is expensive work. Under rulers like Thutmose I and Thutmose III, Egyptian armies push farther than ever before into Syria and the Levant. Cities surrender tribute. Princes swear loyalty. Trade networks stretch across the eastern Mediterranean. Egypt transforms into one of the ancient world's great powers, and power feels intoxicating. You stand near a royal procession after a victorious campaign where foreign tribute passes through Thebes beneath blazing afternoon sunlight. Crowds gather shoulder to shoulder along the streets. Incense smoke drifts above cheering voices. Soldiers march proudly beside wagons carrying cedar, wood exotic animals, gold vessels, and bound prisoners. The spectacle is carefully designed. Empire must appear inevitable. At Karnak Temple, massive columns rise like stone forest toward the sky. Workers haul obelisks across ramps while priests maintain endless rituals honoring Amun now among Egypt's most powerful gods. Temple wealth expands enormously through royal donations and military spoils. Religion and empire feed one another constantly. The gods reward victory. Victory in riches there. You wander through temple courtyards at dusk, where cool shadows gather between towering pillars painted in vivid blues, reds, and golds. Priests move silently carrying oil lamps while distant chanting echoes through stone chambers. The smell of incense settles thickly in the air. For ordinary Egyptians, these temples feel overwhelming, sacred, intimidating. The architecture itself communicates power more effectively than words ever could. And yet even within this aggressive age, humanity remains painfully intimate. You meet a soldier named Panechsi, recovering from a leg wound after campaigns in Canaan. He sits outside a small house near Thebes while his wife changes the linen wrapping around his injury. Their daughter watches nervously nearby, holding a carved wooden doll missing one arm. Panechsi speaks proudly about serving the pharaoh, then quietly admits he still wakes suddenly at night hearing battle noises that no longer exist. History remembers victories more easily than damaged nervous systems. During the reign of Queen Hatshepsut, the empire pauses its outward aggression briefly and turns towards trade and monumental building instead. Her rise itself feels remarkable, a woman claiming full pharaonic authority inside a deeply traditional system. She navigates it carefully. Statues often depict her with royal regalia usually reserved for male kings, false beard included. Not because she wishes literally to become a man, but because kingship in Egypt already carries established visual language. She adapts herself to power rather than reinventing power entirely, and she governs effectively. You travel along the Nile during her reign and notice unusual prosperity. Trade expeditions bring incense trees, ebony leopard skins, and rare goods from Punt. Temples expand magnificently. Bureaucracy functions smoothly. The kingdom exhales for a moment. At Deir el-Bahri, Hatshepsut's mortuary temple rises elegantly against western cliffs above the Nile plain. Terraces glow softly in evening light while desert wind brushes across carefully carved reliefs. You stand there after sunset listening to distant jackals calling through the hills. The place feels calm, balanced, almost timeless. But Egypt's military momentum soon returns under Thutmose III, perhaps the greatest battlefield commander in Egyptian history. His campaigns extend Egyptian influence enormously through calculated speed and strategic aggression. You accompany troops approaching Megiddo before battle. Dawn creeps slowly across rocky hills while soldiers tighten sandals and check weapon straps in tense silence. Horses snort clouds into cool morning air. Officers speak in low, controlled voices. Fear smells strangely metallic before combat. Then the battle begins. Chariots thunder across uneven ground, arrows darken the sky briefly. Men scream, bronze strikes flesh and wood with terrible force, dust rises so thickly that entire formations vanish inside it. Ancient warfare feels chaotic, up close, confused, personal. And afterward comes the silence. You walk among exhausted survivors while wounded men groan softly beside broken shields. Flies gather immediately. A medic pours beer over a deep cut while another soldier stares blankly at nothing. Victory still carries a cost every single time, yet Egypt emerges wealthier and more confident after these campaigns. Foreign princes send tribute, royal treasuries overflow. The Nile Kingdom stands at the center of international diplomacy and trade. But empires create new vulnerabilities alongside power. Distance strains control, generals gain influence, priests accumulate staggering wealth. Court politics sharpen beneath polished ceremony. And somewhere ahead, waiting quietly beneath the brilliance of empire, a king will decide the old gods themselves are no longer enough. The light changes first. Not physically, perhaps. The sun still rises over the Nile in the same pale gold haze. Fishermen still push boats into shallow water before dawn. Bakers still knead dough in dim courtyards while dogs circle hopefully beneath the tables. But emotionally something shifts across Egypt. A strange tension settles inside temples and palaces. Priests whisper more carefully. Sculptors receive unusual instructions. Royal artists begin carving the king differently than before. Not idealized and timeless, but elongated, intimate, almost unsettlingly human. You are entering the reign of Amenhotep IV. Soon he will call himself Akhenaten, and he will try to change the soul of Egypt itself. At first, the transformation appears subtle. Amenhotep IV inherits an empire wealthy beyond imagination. Foreign tribute flows steadily into royal treasuries. Massive temples dominate Thebes. Priests of Amun command extraordinary influence and landholdings. Egypt seems secure beneath divine favor. Too secure, perhaps. Powerful priesthoods now rival royal authority in uncomfortable ways. The god Amun receives endless offerings while temple estates expand like states within the state. Historians still debate Akhenaten's true motivations, but politics almost certainly intertwines with belief. Religious revolution often carries practical ambitions beneath spiritual language. You walk through Karnak during the early years of his reign. The temple complex overwhelms the senses completely. Incense smoke curls upward between colossal columns painted in vivid colours. Priests move through shadowed halls carrying sacred objects hidden beneath linen coverings. Chanting echoes softly across cool stone floors. The place feels eternal. That may be precisely the problem. Amenhotep IV begins elevating a different god above all others, Aten, not represented through animal forms or hidden statues, but through the visible disk of the sun itself. Open light replaces sacred darkness. Simplicity challenges centuries of ritual tradition. At first, many Egyptians likely assume this is temporary royal enthusiasm. Kings favour particular gods all the time. Then the old temples begin losing support. You notice anxiety spreading gradually through religious communities. Priests dismissed from royal favour gather in private conversations after sunset. Temple workshops receive fewer commissions. Some sacred names vanish from official inscriptions altogether. The air inside Thebes feels politically dangerous now. One evening you sit beside an elderly temple scribe drinking beer in a narrow courtyard scented faintly with fig trees and cooling stone. He lowers his voice before speaking. "The gods have always lived together," he says carefully. "Why should one demand loneliness? It is a profoundly human question. Akhenaten does not merely prefer Aten. He restructures religious life around exclusive devotion. Images of older gods disappear from monuments. Traditional rituals weaken. The king presents himself and his family as unique intermediaries between Aten and humanity, and then he does something even more extraordinary. He abandons Thebes entirely. Far from the old religious centres, Akhenaten builds a new capital city in the desert called Akhetaten, known today as Amarna. The location feels deliberate and symbolic, a fresh beginning beneath open sky, untouched by older priesthoods. You arrive there while construction continues under brutal sunlight. Workers drag limestone blocks across dry ground while architects shout instructions through blowing dust. The city rises quickly because the king demands urgency. Everything smells of fresh plaster sweat and hot stone. Unlike older Egyptian cities layered slowly across centuries, Amarna feels strangely planned. Broad roads stretch beneath open sunlight. Temples to Aten lack dark inner sanctuaries. Palaces display intimate scenes of royal life rarely shown before. Akhenaten appears holding his daughters. Nefertiti rides beside him beneath the rays of Aten. Royal affection becomes public imagery. The art itself changes dramatically during this period. Faces appear softer and more emotional. Bodies stretch into elongated forms historians still debate endlessly. Some suggest symbolic style. Others wonder about medical conditions or theological meaning. No clear agreement survives, but the emotional tone unquestionably shifts. You watch artists working inside open studios where sunlight pours across unfinished reliefs. One sculptor pauses while shaping Nefertiti's profile with astonishing delicacy. Dust clings to his forearms. Outside children run laughing through the streets while donkeys bray irritably nearby. Amarna feels alive in a strangely modern way. Less rigid, more intimate, and yet deeply fragile. Because beyond the beauty problems gather, foreign territories begin slipping from Egyptian control during Akhenaten's reign. Letters from desperate governors arrive begging for military support against local rebellions and rival powers. Some plead repeatedly while receiving little meaningful response. The empire weakens while the king focuses on spiritual transformation. You sit beside a weary royal messenger one night after he completes another exhausting journey from Syria. Sand still clings to his sandals. He drinks water greedily before speaking. They ask for soldiers, he says. The court sends prayers. His expression suggests exactly what he thinks of that arrangement. Inside the royal family itself, emotional complexity deepens. Akhenaten and Nefertiti appear unusually close in surviving art, sharing affectionate moments beneath Aten's rays. Their daughters play beside them in carved reliefs filled with movement and tenderness. But royal intimacy cannot protect against mortality. Several princesses likely die young during these years. Disease moves easily through crowded ancient cities. Grief settles quietly behind the radiant imagery of divine sunlight and family unity. You stand outside the palace one evening watching servants light oil lamps as darkness spreads over Amarna. The desert cools quickly after sunset. Somewhere distant, musicians play soft melodies drifting across open courtyards, and for a moment the city feels lonely, only too new, too dependent on one man's vision. Akhenaten himself remains difficult to fully understand across the distance of centuries. Was he sincere, fanatical, politically calculating, emotionally isolated, perhaps all at once? Human beings rarely fit neatly into historical categories. What seems clear is this: he believed utterly in his transformation of Egypt, and Egypt never entirely shared that belief. After nearly 2 decades, the experiment begins unraveling. Akhenaten's health declines. The empire strains externally and internally. Traditional religious institutions wait patiently for opportunity. You notice it in small gestures first. Old amulets quietly reappear around people's necks. Traditional prayers whispered privately after dark. Tiny acts of spiritual caution, because most Egyptians never stop needing the older gods completely. Gods of fertility, protection, death, childbirth, harvests, the intimate divine world woven into daily life long before Aten's blazing abstraction. Then Akhenaten dies, and almost immediately the future he imagined begins slipping away like sand through open fingers. The boy king coughs often, not dramatically at first, just small sounds echoing through palace corridors late at night while servants pretend not to notice. He is young, painfully young, surrounded by advisors old enough to be his grandfathers. Gold collars rest awkwardly against narrow shoulders. Ceremonial crowns feel heavy. The entire kingdom watches him carefully, anxiously, as though Egypt itself might crack if he stumbles. His name is Tutankhamun. Soon it will become Tutankhamun, and even now, before history turns him into legend, you sense how fragile he really is. The city of Amarna still stands beneath harsh desert sunlight when the transition begins. Open courtyards glow white in the heat. Aten's temples remain active. Royal officials continue moving through broad streets carrying documents, offerings, and whispered uncertainties. But the emotional atmosphere has shifted completely since Akhenaten's death. Confidence evaporates quickly after visionary rulers disappear. You walk through administrative halls where scribes exchange guarded glances above stacks of papyrus records. Conversations stop abruptly when certain names arise. No one speaks openly against Akhenaten yet, but silence itself has become revealing. Egypt is preparing to reverse course. The young king likely understands only fragments of the political storm surrounding him. He ascends the throne around 9 years old, guided heavily by powerful figures like A and the military commander Horemheb. These men survived the Amarna revolution carefully. Now they intend to stabilize the kingdom, and stability means restoring the old gods. You stand among crowds during one of the early public ceremonies announcing renewed devotion to Amun and the traditional pantheon. Priests emerge once again in elaborate processions carrying sacred statues through incense smoke and drum beats. Citizens press forward eagerly to witness rituals absent for years. The relief feels almost physical, like a city finally breathing normally again after holding tension too long. The king changes his name from Tutankhamun, living image of Aten, to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. Even royal language becomes part of the restoration. Official inscriptions condemn recent religious upheaval, indirectly describing neglected temples and disrupted sacred order. Akhenaten himself begins disappearing from memory deliberately. History can become political remarkably fast. You travel back toward Thebes as the court attention shifts away from Amarna. The road feels symbolic now, Egypt returning emotionally to older foundations. Workers reopen temple complexes neglected during the Aten period. Stonemasons repair damaged inscriptions, priests resume rituals suspended for years. The smell of incense fills Karnak once more. An elderly woman kneels beside a temple offering at a table clutching flowers and bread. Tears gather quietly in her eyes while chants echo through towering columns nearby. "My mother prayed here," she whispers. Not every historical transformation requires ideology. Sometimes people simply miss familiar rituals. Tutankhamun himself remains an elusive figure beneath later fame. Surviving art shows him hunting, riding chariots, performing ceremonies embracing his queen Ankhesenamun beneath warm sunlight. Yet behind these polished images likely stands a physically vulnerable teenager, shaped by palace isolation and dynastic complications. Modern examinations of his mummy suggest multiple health problems, perhaps a clubfoot, possibly genetic disorders linked to generations of royal intermarriage. He may have relied on walking sticks even while court artists depicted idealized athletic strength. There is something quietly heartbreaking about that contrast. The king presented as divine perfection while struggling simply to move comfortably. You spend one evening near the royal residence where musicians play softly beside reflecting pools under torchlight. Warm desert air carries scents of lotus flowers and perfumed oil. Courtiers laugh carefully around low tables covered with figs, roasted duck, and wine. Tutankhamun sits among them wearing gold jewellery bright against linen robes, yet he seems tired. Young isolated rulers often do. His wife Ankhesenamun, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, remains beside him constantly during public appearances. They are both products of the Amarna world, now helping dismantle it. That emotional contradiction must have felt deeply strange. To restore stability partly by undoing your own parents' revolution, no surviving letters reveal their private thoughts. History rarely preserves intimacy clearly, but sometimes absence itself feels meaningful. Meanwhile, Horemheb strengthens military authority quietly behind the scenes. Egypt's foreign territories require renewed attention after years of neglect. Diplomacy resumes, campaigns restart, the machinery of empire creaks back toward functionality. And through all this, the boy king occupies the ceremonial centre. You accompany a hunting expedition one dawn along marshlands thick with birds rising suddenly from the reeds. Chariot wheels splash through shallow water while attendants chase after the royal party carrying bows and supplies. The air smells of mud-wet plants and horse sweat warming beneath early sunlight. Tutankhamun draws his bow carefully. For a moment he looks confident, relaxed even. Then a coughing fit bends him forward sharply enough that nearby servants exchange quick, worried glances before lowering their eyes again. Mortality waits patiently even inside royal splendour. His reign lasts only about 9 years. Then suddenly he is dead. The details remain uncertain. Historians still debate illness, injury, infection, inherited weakness, perhaps several causes together. Ancient death rarely offers clean explanations. One moment a young king exists beneath the Egyptian sun, then attendants stand silently outside sealed chambers while embalmers begin their work. You enter the preparation room heavy with resin oils, linen, and grief. Priests move methodically through rituals preserving the royal body for eternity. Gold funerary objects arrive in astonishing quantities despite the rushed circumstances surrounding his burial. Everything feels hurried. Tutankhamun dies unexpectedly, and his tomb in the Valley of the Kings appears smaller than many royal burials. Some scholars suspect it was originally intended for another noble occupant before being adapted quickly for the king. Yet even rushed burial preparations produce extraordinary beauty. Gold gleams everywhere by torchlight, delicate jewellery, chariots, thrones, ceremonial weapons, sandals, board games, tiny details of a life interrupted. The Egyptians prepare him not simply for remembrance, but for continuation. You stand in the burial chamber after the final rituals conclude. The air feels cool and still beneath flickering lamps. Painted walls glow softly with sacred scenes guiding the king towards the afterlife. Then workers seal the tomb, and history begins forgetting him almost immediately. Later rulers erase much of the Amarna family from official records. Akhenaten becomes heretic. Tutankhamun becomes a minor transitional figure overshadowed by larger kings. Sand drifts gradually across hidden entrances in the Valley of the Kings. Centuries pass, empires rise and vanish, and beneath silent stone the young king waits in darkness with his treasures untouched, waiting for a distant future that will speak his name more loudly than he ever heard it in life. Old age arrives slowly even for great kings. At first it hides beneath ceremony, beneath gold collars and carefully painted eyes, beneath triumphant inscriptions carved deeply into stone walls where rulers forever appear broad-shouldered, invincible, eternally youthful, beneath the favour of the gods. But the body always notices time, and Egypt is now ruled by a man determined to outlive it. His name is Ramesses II. Later generations will call him Ramesses the Great. Though standing near him in the crowded heat of his court, he feels startlingly human. Tall, commanding, certainly. Charismatic in the way powerful people often become after decades of obedience surrounding them. Yet also restless, proud, intensely aware of legacy. You meet him first in motion. The royal procession pushes through Thebes beneath roaring sunlight while soldiers clear the streets ahead with sharp commands. Chariot wheels grind against packed earth. Horses toss their heads impatiently beneath jewelled harnesses. Incense smoke drifts above cheering crowds pressed tightly along the roadside. And there he stands inside the chariot. Ramesses wears authority like armour. He has inherited a kingdom already ancient beyond comprehension. The pyramids are older to him than medieval castles feel to you. Great temples already stand weathered by centuries of wind and sand. Entire dynasties have risen and vanished before his birth. Perhaps that explains his obsession with permanence. He builds constantly. Temples, statues, obelisks, palaces. entire cities bearing his name. Workers across Egypt spent decades carving Ramesses into stone larger than ordinary human scale. His face appears everywhere, calm and immortal beneath the desert sun. Some rulers seek power. Ramesses seeks memory. You travel north toward Pi-Ramesses, his grand royal capital in the delta. The city hums with military energy and administrative complexity. Warehouses overflow with grain and imported goods. Foreign envoys move through decorated halls speaking dozens of languages. Stable yards stretch endlessly beside training grounds crowded with chariots. The smell here is unforgettable. Horse manure, wet reeds, sweat, cedarwood, perfumed oil, bronze furnaces burning late into the night. Empires carry distinctive scents. Distinctive scents. Ramesses himself thrives inside spectacle. Public appearances feel carefully choreographed. Musicians announce his arrival long before he enters. Courtiers bow low while scribes record every detail of diplomatic ceremonies and religious festivals. And yet unexpectedly he can also seem charming. One evening during a palace banquet, laughter spreads after Ramesses jokes about a court official falling asleep during a tedious report. The room relaxes instantly. Wine flows more freely. Servants exchange relieved glances. Powerful men who occasionally display humour become strangely magnetic. But beneath the confidence waits constant pressure. Egypt's empire faces serious external threats now, especially from the Hittite Empire to the north. Trade routes, border territories and political alliances create dangerous tension across the eastern Mediterranean. Eventually everything narrows toward one famous confrontation: Kadesh. You march northwards with the Egyptian army through dry landscapes baked beneath merciless sun. Dust coats every surface. Soldiers sweat beneath leather armour, while supply wagons creak endlessly behind the main column. Officers study maps by torchlight after dark, their faces drawn tight with concentration. Ramesses rides near the front, always visible, always performing certainty. The Battle of Kadesh becomes one of history's most documented ancient conflicts, partly because Ramesses ensures it. Temple walls later depict him charging heroically through enemy forces, almost single-handedly abandoned briefly, yet saved through divine courage and personal brilliance. Reality appears considerably messier. Accounts differ, but the Egyptians likely walk into a dangerous Hittite ambush after receiving faulty intelligence. Confusion erupts rapidly. Enemy chariots smash into Egyptian camps before full deployment finishes. Soldiers scatter. Officers shout contradictory orders through clouds of dust and panic. You hear terrified horses screaming above the chaos. War collapses quickly into noise and instinct at close range. Ramesses probably does fight bravely during the crisis. Several historians believe his personal leadership helps stabilize the situation long enough to avoid catastrophic defeat. But the triumphant version carved onto temple walls stretches events generously. Kings rarely commission monuments celebrating tactical confusion. Afterward, wounded soldiers sit silently beside campfires while medics clean injuries beneath flickering torchlight. One archer stares numbly at a broken chariot wheel lying half buried nearby. "We survived," he says quietly. Not victory, not glory, just survival. And perhaps that is enough. Eventually Egypt and the Hittites negotiate one of the world's earliest known peace treaties. Diplomacy replaces endless warfare. Royal marriages reinforce political stability. Ramesses presents the agreement publicly as another triumph. There is wisdom in learning when conquest costs too much. Back home, monumental construction continues relentlessly. At Abu Simbel, enormous seated statues of Ramesses gaze across Nubian landscapes with impossible confidence. Inside the temples, carved scenes celebrate military victories and divine favour beneath painted ceilings alive with stars. You stand there at dawn while sunlight slowly enters the sanctuary. The stone feels cool beneath your fingertips. Outside the desert stretches silent and immense. For a moment, Ramesses succeeds. He feels eternal. But enormous building projects require enormous labour. Workers quarry stone under brutal conditions. Farmers pay heavy taxes supporting royal ambition. Administrative pressure spreads across the kingdom despite outward prosperity. You spend time in Deir el Medina, the village housing craftsmen responsible for royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These artisans occupy unusual social status. Literate, skilled, respected. Yet their lives remain difficult. One afternoon, workers refuse labour after delayed grain payments. History's first recorded labour strike unfolds beneath the reign of history's great builder king. The men sit together in exhausted protest while officials scramble nervously between storehouses and administrative offices. Tempers rise, families worry about food supplies, bureaucrats offer excuses nobody believes. Even powerful civilizations depend on people receiving dinner. Ramses ages visibly now. His long reign stretches beyond 60 years. Children become adults beneath his rule. Then grandparents. Court officials who served him as young men die before he does. The king himself grows physically frail despite endless idolized statues. Arthritis twists his body. Dental disease causes constant pain. He survives through sheer stubbornness while sons wait impatiently for succession opportunities that never seem to arrive. Longevity can become politically unsettling. You see him late one evening, sitting quietly beside an open balcony overlooking the Nile. The court festivities have ended hours earlier. Cool night air drifts through linen curtains, carrying distant smells of river water and damp earth. For once he appears tired, not divine, not monumental, just old. Below the palace walls, Egypt continues breathing through darkness. Bakers prepare dawn bread. Guards pace torch-lit courtyards. Somewhere in the distance, temple bells echo softly across sleeping neighbourhoods. And the great king listens to it all in silence, because perhaps beneath every colossal statue and victory inscription, Ramesses understands something simple and terrifying. No monument truly stops time. The tomb robbers move at night, not because darkness hides them completely. The desert moon can shine harshly across the western cliffs, turning sand silver and exposing every movement. But night softens sound. It cools the stone. It makes desperate decisions feel slightly less shameful. You follow narrow paths through the Valley of the Kings, where wind whispers softly between tomb entrances, cut deep into ancient rock. The air smells dry and mineral beneath the stars. Somewhere distant, a jackal cries briefly before silence settles again. Beneath these cliffs lie generations of pharaohs, or what remains of them. Egypt has changed since the age of Ramesses the Great. The empire weakens slowly under economic pressure, foreign threats, political instability and sheer exhaustion. Monumental confidence fades first, then resources, then trust, and eventually even the dead become vulnerable. You arrive in Thebes during the late New Kingdom, where temple walls still glow beautifully beneath morning sunlight, yet ordinary life feels strained underneath the grandeur. Grain shortages spread anxiety through crowded markets. Officials accuse one another of corruption. Workers receive delayed rations more frequently now. The old machinery of empire creaks heavily. At Deir el Medina, the community of royal tomb craftsmen survives uneasily beside the sacred necropolis. Their homes cluster tightly along dusty lanes smelling of bread ovens, sweat, and livestock. Children chase each other between mud-brick walls while exhausted labourers return from the valley, carrying tools across aching shoulders. These workers know the tombs intimately, every hidden chamber, every sealed passage. That knowledge becomes dangerous when hunger arrives. One evening you sit beside a former tomb worker drinking thin beer in near darkness. His hands remain rough with old stone dust embedded permanently into the skin. Outside, desert wind rattles lightly against the doorway. They buried gold beside dead men, he says quietly. Meanwhile my children needed grain. He does not sound proud, only tired. The robberies begin gradually. Small thefts at first, precious oils, linen wrappings, portable jewellery hidden beneath clothing and sold quietly through black market networks stretching across Egypt. But economic desperation deepens over time. Soon entire royal tombs are targeted. You descend into one breached burial chamber by torchlight alongside nervous officials investigating recent looting. The air feels stale and strangely intimate after centuries underground. Broken ceilings crunch beneath your sandals. A smashed coffin lies open nearby, gold leaf torn away brutally from carved wood. The silence inside the chamber feels violated. Ancient Egyptians feared this profoundly. The tomb existed not merely as memorial but as functional spiritual architecture supporting the deceased through eternity. Destroying burial goods threaten cosmic order itself. Yet poverty and corruption slowly overpower sacred fear. Even priests become implicated sometimes. That may be the saddest detail of all. Official investigations survive from this period on papyrus records, remarkably human in tone. Witnesses confess under questioning, guards accept bribes. Tomb robbers describe tunnels, stolen treasures, and divided profits with exhausting practicality. One confessed thief explains how they burned royal coffins to extract gold more easily. You read the words while heat presses heavily through an administrative office crowded with sweating scribes and anxious magistrates. Flies drift lazily above ink pots. Outside, donkeys bray somewhere beyond the courtyard wall. Civilizations rarely collapse or lapse elegantly. Ramesses III attempts restoring stability through military campaigns and administrative reforms, but pressures intensify everywhere. Foreign groups known collectively as the Sea Peoples attack Mediterranean regions violently during this era. Trade networks weaken, internal divisions deepen. You watch soldiers returning from coastal defences looking hollow-eyed and exhausted. Salt stains their clothing. Bronze weapons hang heavy from tired hands. One man sits silently beside the river, washing blood from his forearm without expression. Victory itself now feels temporary. Meanwhile, the royal court grows increasingly fragile. Conspiracies spread through palace corridors scented with incense and fear. One famous plot known today as the Harem Conspiracy likely attempts assassinating Ramesses III himself. Even the pharaoh no longer seems untouchable. Modern scans of Ramesses III's mummy reveal a deep throat wound possibly caused during the conspiracy. The discovery feels hauntingly intimate across 3,000 years. A king murdered inside his own palace, and afterward embalmed carefully as though ceremony might repair violence. You stand inside a dim preparation chamber, where priests work silently over royal remains beneath flickering oil lamps. Resin thickens the air with sharp medicinal sweetness. Linen strips pile nearby in careful stacks. No one speaks above a whisper. Outside the palace walls, ordinary Egyptians continue adapting however they can. Fishermen crowd shrinking catches into woven baskets before dawn. Farmers argue bitterly over irrigation rights. Mothers stretch grain supplies through increasingly creative meals. And always the tombs wait in the western hills filled with unreachable wealth. Temptation becomes almost inevitable. You follow a group of robbers, one moonless night, as they move carefully across rocky ground carrying crude tools wrapped in cloth to soften noise. Their breathing sounds loud in the darkness. One man keeps touching a small protective amulet hanging beneath his tunic. He fears the dead, but he fears hunger more. Inside the tomb passage, torch smoke gathers thickly against painted ceilings, alive with gods guiding royal souls through the afterlife. The robbers pause uneasily before striking through sealed doorways. For a moment, even they seem ashamed. Then the work begins. Stone cracks echo softly underground. Gold glints in torchlight. Ancient silence shatters beneath human desperation. Later, priests and officials attempt protecting royal mummies by secretly relocating them into hidden caches away from vulnerable tombs. Great kings once buried beneath magnificent monuments now lie crowded together in concealed chambers for safety. There is something deeply melancholy about it. Pharaohs who commanded empires hidden hurriedly like valuables during wartime. You stand among priests transporting wrapped royal bodies through narrow desert paths before dawn. The procession moves quietly beneath cold stars. Sand shifts softly under careful footsteps. One priest pauses beside the mummy of Seti I, touching the linen gently. He deserved better, he murmurs. Perhaps they all did. Yet history rarely grants permanent security, not even to those who believe themselves divine. The tombs once built to guarantee eternity become targets instead. Sacred spaces turn into crime scenes. Royal immortality dissolves beneath economic pressure and human need, and still the Nile continues flowing calmly beside it all. Morning sunlight spreads across the river as fishermen push boats into the water. Temple bells ring faintly from distant courtyards. Somewhere bread begins baking again. Life continues stubbornly even while kingdoms quietly unravel. The great age of pharaohs is not over yet, but you can already feel the darkness gathering beyond the western cliffs. The women of ancient Egypt rarely stand still in the historical record. Even when artists carve them beside powerful men, even when inscriptions reduce them to titles and ceremonies, you sense movement beneath the stone. Negotiation, intelligence, survival. Quiet forms of influence exercised inside palaces, temples, households, and crowded city streets. Because kingdoms do not function through kings alone. And Egypt, perhaps more than many ancient societies, understands this deeply. You begin in the private chambers of a royal palace, where dawn light filters softly through linen curtains, stirring in the breeze from the Nile. Servants move quietly carrying perfume oils, cosmetics, and folded garments. Somewhere nearby, musicians practice gentle melodies before the day's ceremonies begin. The air smells faintly of lotus oil and warm plaster. A queen sits before a polished bronze mirror, while attendants braid her hair carefully with beads of gold and lapis lazuli. Outside officials wait nervously for royal audiences that may determine military campaigns, tax policies, or diplomatic alliances. Inside this room, power moves differently. Not weaker, simply less visible. Egyptian royal women can own property, manage estates, initiate legal actions, and oversee religious institutions in ways unusual for many ancient cultures. Ordinary women also possess more legal autonomy than outsiders sometimes expect. They inherit wealth, divorce husbands, conduct business. Life remains deeply unequal, certainly. Patriarchal expectations shape nearly everything. Yet women here are not merely silent ornaments. You walk through market streets in Thebes where female merchants sell linen, beer, vegetables, and perfume oils beneath woven awnings protecting them from the sun. Children cling to their mothers' robes while arguments erupt cheerfully over prices. The city smells of bread, livestock, sweat, and river water drying on stone. An older woman weighing onions glances toward a young scribe attempting to flirt awkwardly nearby. He writes poetry, she says dryly, but still cannot bargain properly. Her friends burst into laughter. Across every century, humour survives beautifully. Inside elite households, however, emotional life grows more dangerous. Royal succession produces constant tension because bloodlines carry political legitimacy. Marriage becomes strategy as much as affection. Brothers marry sisters within the royal family, partly to preserve dynastic purity and sacred identity. The emotional cost remains mostly invisible. You meet Queen Tiye during the reign of Amenhotep III, long before the chaos of Akhenaten's revolution. She possesses extraordinary political influence despite not being born royal herself. Foreign kings address diplomatic letters directly to her. Advisors treat her opinion seriously. At court banquets, she watches everything. Nothing escapes her attention. One evening you observe Tiye seated beside the aging pharaoh while dancers move gracefully across polished floors lit by flickering oil lamps. Courtiers speak carefully in her presence. When a nervous official stumbles through a report, Tiye asks one calm question that exposes the entire problem immediately. The room falls silent. Intelligence can feel intimidating even without outraised voices. Then comes Nefertiti. Beautiful certainly, though surviving busts and statues likely idealize her features. Yet beauty alone never explains her historical presence. She appears constantly beside Akhenaten during the Aten Revolution, participating visibly in religious ceremonies and state imagery. At times she almost seems co-ruler. You stand inside a sunlit courtyard at Amarna where Nefertiti offers prayers beneath Aten's rays while priests and officials kneel nearby. Dust drifts softly through warm air. Her daughters cluster around her linen robes, laughing briefly before attendants guide them back into ceremonial stillness. For a moment, the royal family appears strangely intimate, almost modern, but intimacy inside royal courts remains fragile. Children die young, alliances shift, public devotion hides private loneliness. Historians still debate what became of Nefertiti during Akhenaten's later reign. Did she die suddenly? Rule briefly herself, fall from favour. No clear agreement survives. Absence becomes part of her mystery. Far from the palaces, ordinary women navigate entirely different emotional worlds. You spend time in Deir el-Medina, among the families of tomb workers where daily life unfolds through exhausting practical routines. Women rise before sunrise preparing bread from ground grain while smoke thickens low kitchen rooms. Laundry dries stiffly beneath desert heat. Water jars must be carried constantly from communal sources. Illness spreads easily through crowded homes, yet tenderness survives everywhere. One mother hums softly while cleaning dust from her sleeping child's face. Another woman waits anxiously beside the village entrance for her husband, returning from dangerous tomb work beneath unstable rock. Love rarely appears dramatically in ancient records. Mostly it exists through small acts of care repeated daily. Egyptian love poetry survives from later periods with surprising emotional warmth. Lovers compare one another to gardens, wine music, birdsong. Desire appears playful and deeply human rather than abstract. You overhear a young man reciting nervous poetry beside the river at dusk while his companion pretends not to smile too obviously. "My heart wishes to bathe beside you," he says awkwardly. She laughs. Fortunately for him, she keeps listening. But palace life remains harsher than romance poems suggest. Royal women often live surrounded by surveillance, expectation, and political danger. One wrong alliance or failed succession can become catastrophic. You feel this tension strongly around Queen Ankhesenamun after Tutankhamun's death. Widowed young and trapped inside uncertain court politics, she likely faces terrifying vulnerability. One surviving diplomatic letter, possibly written by her, begs a foreign king to send a prince for marriage because she fears being forced into union with someone beneath royal status. The desperation inside that request echoes painfully across centuries. Imagine the loneliness required to trust foreign strangers more than your own court. Then there is Hatshepsut, not simply queen, pharaoh. You stand before her temple at Deir el-Bahri, where elegant terraces rise against western cliffs glowing softly beneath evening light. Workers and priests move like shadows across broad stairways, while incense smoke drifts upward into cooling air. Her statues depict calm authority, measured confidence. Yet after her death, many of those images are deliberately damaged or erased. Later rulers attempt reducing her visibility within official history, perhaps out of political necessity, perhaps discomfort with female kingship. Memory itself becomes contested ground, and still despite erasure she remains. That may be one of the most moving truths about ancient Egypt. Women survive within its story not because history preserved them generously, but because their presence proved too large to fully remove. Queens negotiate diplomacy. Mothers preserve households during famine. Priestesses maintain sacred rituals. Workers' wives hold exhausted communities together through endless practical labour. Even the goddesses themselves shape Egyptian imagination profoundly. Isis, Hathor, Sekhmet. Powerful, protective, nurturing, terrifying. Divinity here often wears female form comfortably. You sit beside the Nile one warm night watching moonlight ripple across black water, while distant temple music drifts faintly through the darkness. Nearby, women gather laundry silently before dawn work begins again. The kingdom around them rises and falls across centuries. Dynasties fracture. Empires weaken. Tombs are buried by sand. But human tenderness, ambition, grief, intelligence, humour and endurance continue quietly through it all, and often behind the carved stone faces of kings' women are the ones keeping Egypt alive. Night settles differently inside an Egyptian temple. Outside the cities remain noisy long after sunset. Donkeys complain in narrow streets. Families eat evening meals beside smoking lamps. Musicians play somewhere beyond crowded courtyards while the Nile moves quietly through darkness, carrying cool air along its banks. But inside the temple's sound changes. Footsteps soften against stone floors. Incense thickens the air into something dreamlike. Shadows gather between painted columns where gods stare down with animal faces and unreadable eyes. You enter Karnak after midnight beside a procession of priests carrying oil lamps cupped carefully against the breeze. Their linen robes whisper softly as they walk. The scent of myrrh and cedar resin lingers heavily beneath the high ceilings. Everything feels hidden here. Not secret exactly, sacred. Egyptian religion does not separate cleanly from ordinary life because ordinary life already feels full of divine presence. Gods inhabit rivers, storms, childbirth, disease, justice, fertility, kingship, dreams, and death itself. The sacred lives everywhere at once, which means fear does too. People pray constantly because the world feels unstable beneath the surface. You notice it in tiny gestures first. A fisherman touching an amulet before pushing his boat into uncertain water. A mother whispering prayers over a feverish child. Workers leaving small offerings beside household shrines before dangerous labour. Religion here is intimate long before it becomes monumental. The gods themselves feel remarkably human in their emotions despite their immense power. They become angry, jealous, loving, protective, violent, forgiving. Stories about them shift over centuries and regions overlapping, rather than fitting neatly into one fixed system. Osiris rules the dead after being murdered and restored. Isis searches desperately for her lost husband. Horus battles chaos and injury. Sekhmet nearly destroys humanity in divine rage. The Egyptian spiritual world breathes with contradiction, and somehow that makes it feel believable. You spend one humid afternoon beside temple scribes copying funerary texts onto fresh papyrus. Ink stains their fingers dark blue and black. Open windows allow faint breezes carrying smells of river mud and distant cooking fires into the room. One young apprentice pauses while drawing protective symbols. Words survive longer than bodies, he says quietly. The statement feels especially true in Egypt. Egypt. Magic and writing intertwine deeply here. To name something is to influence it. Spoken prayers, written spells, carved symbols, and ritual gestures all possess real force within Egyptian understanding. Modern distinctions between religion and magic barely apply. The Egyptians call magical power Heka, not delusion, not trickery. A fundamental force woven into creation itself. You watch a healer preparing remedies for an injured labourer beneath flickering lamplight. Crushed herbs mix with honey inside a clay bowl, while protective spells are murmured softly beside practical treatment. Medicine and magic cooperate naturally. Ancient people rarely see contradiction where modern minds expect it. The labourer winces as linen wrappings tighten around a swollen ankle. The healer touches an amulet briefly against the bandage before nodding with quiet confidence. Now we wait, it says, and waiting becomes part of survival. Dreams also matter enormously. Egyptians believe the sleeping mind moves closer to divine realms where gods, spirits, and warnings may appear. Some temples even encourage dream incubation rituals where individuals sleep inside sacred spaces, hoping for healing or guidance. You lie one night inside a temple chamber cooled by thick stone walls while distant chanting echoes faintly through darkness. The smell of incense clings to everything. Somewhere nearby, another visitor mutters uneasily in sleep. When morning arrives, priests listen carefully to remembered visions. A hawk may signal protection. Floodwater may predict change. Teeth falling out may warn of death. Human beings have always searched dreams for reassurance against uncertainty. Death itself shapes nearly every layer of Egyptian spirituality. Not because Egyptians obsess morbidly over dying, but because they view existence as continuous rather than final. Tombs become houses for eternity. Funeral rituals become practical preparation. The afterlife requires organization. You descend into a noble tomb while painters finish scenes along the walls beneath smoking oil lamps. Servants carrying food offerings appear beside fishing scenes, musicians, gardens, and banquets. The dead wish to remember beauty. One artist pauses while painting lotus flowers blooming across a marsh scene. He loved the river, the painter explained simply. There is profound tenderness in preserving someone's favourite landscape for eternity. The famous Book of the Dead develops gradually through centuries as collections of spells guiding souls through dangers awaiting after death. Contrary to the modern title, no single unified book exists. Different individuals commission different texts depending on wealth and preference. Still, certain ideas remain central. The heart must remain truthful. The soul must navigate judgment. And somewhere beyond darkness waits the weighing of the heart against the feather of Maat. You watch priests perform funerary rites beside the Nile at sunset, while mourners stand silently in linen stained with dust and tears. The western horizon burns deep orange above the desert cliffs where tombs wait hidden inside stone. A widow touches her husband's coffin gently before it disappears into shadow. No philosophy fully removes grief. Not even one promising eternity. Animals also move through Egyptian religion with startling intimacy. Cats, ibises, crocodiles, bulls, jackals, falcons. Some become sacred manifestations of divine power. Temples care for holy animals with extraordinary attention, while pilgrims leave offerings seeking blessings. You visit a temple dedicated to Basta, where cats weave comfortably between worshippers carrying flowers and small bronze statues. The atmosphere feels oddly peaceful. Children laugh softly while priests move through sunlight scented with incense and warm stone. One cat leaps elegantly onto your lap without invitation. Ancient Egypt would probably consider this spiritually significant, and perhaps they are not entirely wrong. But beneath the beauty and symbolism lies constant anxiety about chaos. Egyptians fear disorder deeply because they remember how fragile civilization becomes when floods fail, rulers weaken or enemies invade. Religious ritual helps maintain cosmic stability itself. Every prayer becomes partly protective. Every ceremony pushes back darkness a little longer. You stand outside a temple before dawn while priests greet the rising sun with hymns echoing across quiet courtyards. The air feels cool against your skin. Birds begin calling from river reeds nearby. For a moment, the world seems balanced perfectly between shadow and light. That feeling may explain ancient Egyptian religion better than any scholarly description ever could. Not certainty, not blind faith. Just that the fragile hope that careful rituals' honest hearts remembered names and sacred stories might hold chaos away long enough for another sunrise. The foreign kings arrive gradually at first. A Libyan commander serving inside the Egyptian military settles his family in the delta. Nubian rulers strengthen their authority far to the south. Assyrian messengers appear carrying hard-edged diplomacy from distant empires, expanding relentlessly across the Near East. None of it feels catastrophic immediately. That is how long declines usually unfold. The temples still stand. Priests still chant before dawn. Farmers still bend over green fields along the Nile beneath clouds of insects and heat. Egypt continues looking ancient and eternal from a distance. But underneath, exhaustion spreads. You travel north through the delta, where marshes shimmer beneath pale skies and reeds rustle softly beside crowded waterways. Fishing villages cluster along muddy banks while trade boats slide past carrying grain, papyrus, wine and rumours. Always rumours. One man speaks quietly about rising taxes, another about corrupt officials stealing temple land. Someone else mutters about foreign mercenaries receiving better treatment than local soldiers. The emotional fabric holding Egypt together feels thinner now. After the great new kingdom weakens, political authority fractures repeatedly. Rival dynasties compete for legitimacy across different regions. Priests of Amun in Thebes accumulate enormous influence. Local rulers govern semi-independently while still pretending loyalty to distant kings. Egypt begins dividing internally again. You sit inside a crowded administrative office, where sweating scribes argue over grain deliveries delayed by regional disputes. Papyrus sheets litter every table. Flies drift lazily through shafts of afternoon light. Outside the city hums with ordinary commerce despite the tension. An exhausted official rubs his forehead. Everyone claims authority, he says bitterly. No one accepts responsibility. A timeless political complaint. Meanwhile, Libyan groups that once entered Egypt gradually as migrants and soldiers establish ruling dynasties of their own. These kings adopt Egyptian customs enthusiastically. They build temples, commission statues, and present themselves as proper pharaohs beneath the protection of ancient gods. Egyptian civilization proves surprisingly absorbent. Foreign rulers often become culturally Egyptian faster than Egypt becomes foreign. Yet identity still matters emotionally. You notice subtle discomfort in conversations among older temple elites. Some speak nostalgically about earlier dynasties with almost painful longing. Not because the present feels entirely broken, because it feels uncertain, and uncertainty erodes confidence slowly. Farther south in Nubia, another power rises along the Nile. The Kushite kings rule from Napata beneath the shadow of older Egyptian influence absorbed over centuries. They admire Egyptian religion deeply, preserve traditions many Egyptians themselves have neglected, study ancient rituals and royal symbolism carefully. Then they march north. You travel beside Kushite troops moving through Upper Egypt beneath blazing sunlight. Their armour glints sharply against dark skin coated with desert dust. Drums echo across the valley, while local populations watch cautiously from village edges. Some fear invasion, others welcome stability from anywhere it might come. King Piye, one of the great Nubian rulers, records his conquest of Egypt with fascinating emotion. He presents himself not merely as conqueror, but as restorer of sacred order against corrupt local rulers. History repeats familiar patterns endlessly. The Kushite pharaohs govern respectfully towards Egyptian traditions. Temples receive support again. Ancient artistic styles return deliberately. Religious devotion deepens. In some ways, the Nubian rulers appear more traditionally Egyptian than many recent Egyptian dynasties themselves. You stand inside Karnak during a ceremony led under Kushite rule while incense smoke curls upward between towering columns worn smooth by centuries of touch and wind. Priests chant ancient hymns older than entire empires elsewhere in the world. The atmosphere feels reverent, almost restorative, yet larger dangers approach from the northeast. The Assyrian Empire expands with terrifying efficiency across the Near East during this era. Their armies possess brutal military organization and siege capabilities unmatched by many rivals. Stories about Assyrian warfare spread ahead of them like smoke. Cities destroyed. Populations deported, kings humiliated publicly. Fear becomes part of Assyrian strategy. You encounter refugees arriving southward, carrying exhausted children and hastily packed belongings after border conflicts intensify. Dust coats their clothing. One elderly man keeps glancing backward as though expecting soldiers to appear at any moment. "We heard what happened to other cities," he says softly. He does not elaborate further. He does not need to. Eventually Assyrian armies invade Egypt directly. Battles erupt across the Delta and Nile Valley. Kushite rulers resist fiercely but struggle against the scale of Assyrian military pressure. You stand near Memphis after conflict scars the city. Smoke drifts above damaged districts. Temples remain standing but tense beneath armed occupation. Civilians move cautiously through streets littered with debris and broken carts. A woman sweeps dust from her doorway methodically despite everything. Human dignity survives strangely stubborn circumstances. Assyrian control over Egypt proves unstable and temporary, but the psychological impact runs deep. Egypt is no longer unquestionably dominant within its own world. Larger imperial systems now surround it. The old confidence fades further, and still the Nile flows calmly through every political transformation. That continuity comforts people. Farmers continue planting according to flood cycles older than dynasties. Fishermen rise before dawn exactly as their ancestors did thousands of years earlier. Children still laugh beside irrigation canals. Life resists historical drama whenever possible. Later rulers from the Sate dynasty attempt restoring Egyptian independence and cultural revival once more. There is genuine energy during this period. Trade expands, art flourishes, officials study ancient texts intentionally, almost archaeologically seeking wisdom from earlier ages. Already Egypt begins looking back backward toward its own golden past. That realization feels quietly heartbreaking. A civilization old enough to become nostalgic for itself. You wander through workshops where artists carefully imitate styles from centuries earlier, while discussing which ancient kings represented true greatness. The pyramids, already impossibly old, become symbols of lost certainty. Memory itself hardened into national identity. Then Persian forces arrive under Cambyses II. Another conquest, another foreign dynasty claiming the Nile. The transition feels weary now rather than shocking. Egypt possesses immense cultural gravity, but politically the kingdom grows increasingly vulnerable to larger imperial powers moving across connected worlds of trade, warfare, and ambition. You stand beside the river at sunset while temple bells echo faintly from distant courtyards. Palm trees sway gently in cooling wind. Nearby, an old fisherman repairs torn nets beneath fading light. How many kings have ruled Egypt, you ask him. He shrugs slowly without looking up. The river remembers, he says, people forget. Then darkness settles softly across the Nile once more. The soldiers smell of rain leather and long journeys. You notice it before you fully see them. A different scent moving through the dry Egyptian air. Horses damp from coastal weather far beyond the Nile. Wool cloaks carrying traces of mountain climates foreign to this landscape of stone and sun. Then the Macedonians appear. Bronze flashes beneath our hard daylight. Long spears sway in disciplined rhythm. Dust rises around marching feet while interpreters hurry nervously between officers and local officials attempting polite conversation. Egypt boy. Another foreign conqueror arrive, but this one feels different somehow. His name is Alexander, and by the time he reaches Egypt in 332 BCE, stories already surround him like heat around desert rock. Cities have surrendered without resistance. Empires have collapsed before him. Some call him liberator, others butcher, others still something dangerously close to divine. Most people simply hope he passes through quickly. You travel westward along the Mediterranean coast where sea wind cools the evenings and gulls wheel above crowded harbours. Egyptian villagers gather silently beside the roads as Alexander's army advances south from defeated Persian territories. Children stare openly at the unfamiliar armour and strange horses. Older men exchange cautious glances. No one quite knows what comes next. The Persian Empire has ruled Egypt harshly at times, provoking repeated revolts and resentment. So when Alexander enters the country, many Egyptians receive him less as invader and more as relief from previous domination. History often works through relative disappointment. You first glimpse Alexander near Memphis during a ceremonial procession beneath blazing sunlight. He rides confidently yet restlessly, younger than expected. Shockingly young, in fact. Not yet 30. His hair curls damply against his forehead from the heat while attendants struggle keeping pace around him. He studies everything, the temples, the river, the people watching from shaded doorways. There is intense curiosity in him alongside ambition. Priests greet him carefully with traditional rituals acknowledging pharaonic authority. Alexander participates enthusiastically because he understands symbolism instinctively. Conquerors survive longer when they respect local sacred language. Inside Egyptian temples, he allows himself to become pharaoh. You accompany a delegation travelling toward the Oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis deep within the western desert. The journey feels almost unreal. Endless sand stretches beneath white sky, while camels groan beneath supplies and guides navigate through landscapes stripped nearly bare of life. At night, cold settles surprisingly fast across the dunes. Stars appear sharp enough to wound. Alexander insists upon making this pilgrimage despite the danger, because legitimacy matters profoundly. The oracle's exact words remain uncertain. Ancient accounts contradict one another constantly. Some claim the priests greeted him as divine son of Amun. Perhaps they did. Perhaps later storytellers embroidered the moment. Either way, Alexander emerges changed by it. You see the effect in his expression afterward. Increased confidence mixed with isolation. Men treated as gods often become lonelier, not happier. Back along the coast, he chooses the site for a new city, Alexandria. At first, it seems almost absurd. Empty shoreline battered by Mediterranean wind. Fishermen's huts, salt marshes, seabirds crying above rough water. Yet Alexander stands there imagining greatness. Ready! You walk beside surveyors stretching ropes beneath the harsh sunlight, while architects discuss harbours, streets and defensive walls in excited overlapping voices. Sand sticks to sweaty skin. Waves crash endlessly nearby, carrying the smell of salt and seaweed. The future begins quietly. Alexander himself will never see the city fully built. His life moves too quickly for permanence. Soon he marches east again, chasing wider conquests across Persia and beyond toward India. But he leaves something important behind in Egypt, a new direction. The old pharaonic world begins blending now with Greek language, Greek administration, Greek philosophy, and Mediterranean trade culture. Not instantly, not cleanly, but steadily. You notice it first in port districts where Egyptian merchants negotiate with Greek sailors over wine, papyrus, olive oil, and grain. Different alphabets appear side by side on documents. Foreign gods mingle beside older Egyptian deities. The world feels larger suddenly, and more connected. After Alexander dies unexpectedly in Babylon, chaos erupts across his empire almost immediately. Generals compete savagely for territory. Alliances shift through betrayal and warfare. Egypt falls under the control of one of his commanders, Ptolemy. Practical, intelligent, less dazzling than Alexander perhaps, but more patient. He moves Alexander's body to Egypt, eventually understanding perfectly how symbolism strengthens legitimacy. The conqueror who admired pharaohs now rests among them. There is something strangely poetic about that. The Ptolemaic dynasty begins from this collision between Greek ambition and Egyptian antiquity. Greek-speaking rulers govern Egypt for centuries while gradually adopting aspects of pharaonic tradition themselves. You attend a royal ceremony, where Greek officials wearing white linen stand beside Egyptian priests carrying sacred emblems older than Homeric poetry. Incense smoke drifts upward, while translators murmur constantly between languages. The atmosphere feels layered rather than unified, not conflict exactly, but negotiation. Ordinary Egyptians adapt as people usually do. Farmers continue planting beside the Nile. Fishermen continue mending nets. Craftsmen learn enough Greek to bargain with new customers. Some resent foreign elites deeply. Others pursue opportunities through the changing order. Life continues through compromise more often than through resistance. One evening you sit beside a dock worker in early Alexandria, while ships creak softly against harbour ropes under moonlight. The city still smells unfinished. Fresh-cut stone, tar, salt water, human ambition. What do you think this place becomes, you ask him. He watches labourers unloading marble columns from a distant ship. Busy, he says finally. A wonderfully practical answer, and correct. Alexandria grows rapidly into one of the ancient world's greatest cities. Scholars, merchants, sailors, priests, diplomats and adventurers crowd its streets beneath towering lighthouses and expanding libraries. Greek theatres rise beside Egyptian temples. Philosophers debate while grain shipments depart constantly toward hungry Mediterranean markets. Egypt changes again, not erased, never fully erased, but transformed. You stand at the harbour before dawn watching first lights spread across the Mediterranean while gulls circle above fishing boats returning with silver catches. Behind you the city murmurs awake through dozens of languages at once, and somewhere beyond the horizon waits another rising power. Rome. Alexandria never truly sleeps. Even near midnight, voices drift through its streets beneath oil lamps swaying in sea wind. Sailors argue beside crowded taverns. Philosophers continue debates long after sensible people should have gone home. Somewhere in the darkness a musician plays softly, while waves strike the harbour walls in patient rhythm. The city smells of salt, parchment, fish, perfume oil and ambition. So much ambition. You walk through Alexandria during the height of the Ptolemaic age when the city glitters like a promise at the edge of the Mediterranean. Marble colonnades stretch beside crowded markets where Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, Nubian and Phoenician merchants bargain in overlapping languages. No other city in Egypt has ever felt quite like this. Not sacred in the old way, alive in a newer one. The lighthouse of Pharaohs towers above the harbour, visible from astonishing distances at sea. By day, sunlight flashes against pale stone. By night, great fires guide ships safely toward Alexandria's crowded docks. You stand below it during a storm while wind snaps violently against cloaks and waves hammer the breakwater hard enough to spray salt water high into the air. Sailors shout through the chaos while harbour workers scramble securing ropes and cargo. The lighthouse burns steadily through all of it. A simple thing perhaps, just light against darkness. Yet human beings have always loved symbols of safe arrival. Farther inland rises another monument to human longing, the library, or perhaps more accurately the libraries. Collections spread across institutions connected to the Mouseion, the great scholarly centre supported by the Ptolemaic rulers. The exact size remains debated by historians, but the ambition feels unmistakable. To gather all knowledge. Imagine the confidence required for such a project. You enter long halls lined with papyrus scrolls stored carefully inside wooden shelves. The air smells dry and dusty with traces of ink and old reeds. Scholars move quietly between reading rooms carrying manuscripts against their chests like fragile treasures. Some study mathematics, others astronomy, medicine, poetry, geography, engineering, philosophy. Human curiosity fills every corner. A librarian explains proudly how agents acquire text from across the known world. Ships arriving in Alexandria may surrender manuscripts temporarily for copying. Scholars travel enormous distances seeking rare works. Translators labour constantly converting ideas between languages. Knowledge becomes imperial prestige. The Ptolemaic kings understand this perfectly. One afternoon you sit beside a tired scholar from Rhodes who has spent months comparing different copies of Homeric poetry. His eyes ache from endless reading. Ink stains the edge of his sleeve. "Do you know what the hardest part is?" he asks quietly. You expect some profound philosophical answer. "Other scholars," he mutters. Academia, it seems, remains comfortingly familiar across millennia. Yet the library is not only intellectual vanity. Real discoveries emerge here. Mathematicians calculate geometry with astonishing sophistication. Astronomers chart stars carefully across clear Egyptian skies. Physicians study anatomy and illness systematically. For moments at a time, Alexandria feels like humanity reaching beyond survival toward understanding. And still ordinary life continues underneath the brilliance. You wander through poorer districts where fishermen repair torn nets beside narrow alleys, smelling of seaweed and cooking lentils. Children chase stray cats between market stalls. Laundry hangs above crowded streets fluttering in salty wind. A woman sells warm bread beside a public square while complaining loudly about grain prices. Civilization may advance dramatically. People still argue about food costs. The Ptolemaic rulers themselves remain complicated figures. Greek-speaking monarchs governing Egyptian populations through a blend of foreign administration and pharaonic tradition. Some genuinely embrace Egypt, others treat it mainly as a wealthy possession feeding Mediterranean ambitions. Court life feels glittering and dangerous simultaneously. You attend a royal banquet where musicians perform beside fountains scented faintly with rose oil. Gold cups catch firelight beautifully, while diplomats from distant kingdoms exchange cautious compliments across crowded tables. Everyone smiles. Almost nobody trusts anyone entirely. The dynasty survives through careful alliances, sibling marriages, political murders, and endless negotiation. Brothers marry sisters following both Egyptian precedent and dynastic strategy. Succession disputes erupt repeatedly. Luxury and paranoia become inseparable. Meanwhile, religion continues blending in fascinating ways. Greek settlers identify Egyptian gods with their own deities. Serapis emerges as a new syncretic god combining elements from different traditions. Temples adapt creatively. You visit one sanctuary where Greek architectural styles frame deeply Egyptian rituals involving incense, sacred chants, and offerings to ancient powers older than Alexander himself. Cultures do not simply replace one another. They absorb, adapt, overlap. At the harbour, ships arrive constantly carrying grain toward hungry Mediterranean cities. Egypt remains astonishingly fertile compared to many neighbouring regions. The Nile still determines prosperity beneath all political transformations. You stand beside dock workers unloading wheat under crushing afternoon heat. Sweat darkens linen clothing. Gulls scream overhead, diving towards spilled grain. Supervisors shout inventory counts while scribes record shipments rapidly on wax tablets. An older labourer wipes his forehead tiredly. Everyone eats because of this river, he says. He gestures southward toward the unseen Nile, and still nobody can control it. That truth humbles every ruler eventually. Inside the scholarly districts, however, confidence still flourishes. Eratosthenes calculates Earth's circumference with startling accuracy using shadows and geometry. Physicians debate anatomy late into the night. Philosophers argue whether human happiness comes through pleasure, discipline, knowledge, or acceptance. The conversation feels endless and deeply alive. You spend one cool evening inside a courtyard where scholars gather, after dark drinking wine diluted carefully with water while sea breeze moves through olive trees overhead. Someone recites poetry, someone else criticizes it mercilessly. Laughter spreads across the group. For a moment the world feels almost peaceful, but history rarely leaves great cities untouched for long. Political instability grows across the Ptolemaic dynasty over generations. Rome becomes increasingly powerful in Mediterranean affairs. Egyptian rulers borrow heavily manipulate alliances desperately, and rely more frequently on Roman intervention during internal disputes. Dependency creeps in quietly. Alexandria itself also experiences violence. Riots, religious tension, political unrest. Great cities concentrate brilliance and instability together. And the library. Its destruction remains frustratingly uncertain. No single dramatic fire likely erases everything at once despite popular imagination. Loss probably unfolds gradually through wars, neglect, shifting politics, and centuries of damage, which somehow feels sadder. Knowledge disappearing slowly while people remain busy surviving immediate crises. You stand at the harbour late one night watching torchlight ripple across dark water beneath the enormous lighthouse. Somewhere beyond the city, waves move endlessly against unseen shores. Behind you, scholars still read by lamplight. Ahead, Rome waits patiently, and Egypt, ancient Egypt, drifts closer toward its final queen. Cleopatra learns early that love alone never protects anyone. Power might, wealth sometimes, intelligence certainly helps, but affection by itself remains fragile inside royal courts where siblings betray one another over breakfast and armies decide political arguments before sunset. By the time you meet her, she already understands this completely. The palace at Alexandria rises bright against the Mediterranean shore, its balconies catching sea wind, heavy with salt and distant rain. Inside, servants move silently across mosaic floors while guards watch every doorway with practiced suspicion. The air smells of papyrus, perfume oil, lamp smoke, and anxiety. Cleopatra VII is not yet the legendary seductress imagined by later Roman propaganda. She is young, highly educated, multilingual, politically alert, and surrounded by danger from the moment she inherits power alongside her brother Ptolemy XIII. Sibling marriage remains dynastic tradition, so does rivalry. You first see her during a council meeting where advisors argue nervously over Roman politics while scribes record every word beside open windows facing the harbour. Cleopatra listens far more than she speaks at first. Then one elderly official interrupts her impatiently. The room grows very still afterward. Cleopatra responds calmly, correcting his financial calculations from memory without glancing at the records. No raised voice, no theatrical anger, just precision. The official lowers his eyes immediately. Intelligence becomes a survival skill here. Egypt at this stage survives partly through Roman tolerance. The old independence of pharaohs has weakened beneath debt diplomacy and Mediterranean power struggles. Roman generals treat Egyptian grain supplies as strategically essential. Roman politicians interfere constantly in dynastic disputes. Alexandria still glitters magnificently from the outside. Inside, the kingdom feels cornered. Cleopatra's relationship with her younger brother collapses quickly into open conflict. Court factions divide. Advisors manipulate both rulers. Eventually, Cleopatra is pushed from Alexandria, entirely forced into temporary exile, while her brother's supporters tighten control. You travel with her through desert roads east of the Nile where dust coats everything beneath relentless heat. Her reduced entourage moves cautiously between scattered settlements, while messengers ride constantly carrying rumours from the capital. At night she studies maps by lamplight instead of sleeping. Defeat sharpens certain people. Then Rome arrives more directly than ever before. Julius Caesar enters Alexandria pursuing his rival Pompey during the Roman Civil War. Pompey himself is murdered upon arrival in Egypt by local officials hoping to impress Caesar. Instead, the gesture horrifies him. You stand near the harbour when Pompey's severed head is presented. The atmosphere feels strained and deeply uncomfortable. Even hardened soldiers look away. Violence intended as diplomacy rarely lands gracefully. Cleopatra immediately understands the opportunity before her. She needs Roman support to reclaim power. Caesar needs stability in Egypt. History pivots now through personality as much as politics. The famous story claims Cleopatra smuggles herself into Caesar's quarters wrapped inside bedding or a carpet. The exact details remain uncertain, but the emotional truth feels plausible because the act itself reveals extraordinary boldness. You imagine the moment clearly. A dimly lit chamber overlooking the sea. Roman guards suspicious at the doorway. Caesar exhausted from war and political chaos. Then Cleopatra emerging unexpectedly into the room. Not shy, not submissive. Prepared. Their relationship becomes one of history's most analysed and mythologized partnerships. Yet stripped of legend, it likely begins through mutual recognition. Two intelligent political operators understanding each other immediately. Caesar is decades older than Cleopatra, hardened by war ambition and Roman politics, yet around her he seems briefly less exhausted. You observe them one evening aboard a royal barge drifting along the Nile beneath lantern light reflecting softly across black water. Musicians play quietly nearby while warm wind moves through linen curtains. For once Caesar appears relaxed. Cleopatra laughs at something he says and touches his arm lightly. The intimacy feels real. So does the calculation underneath it. War erupts in Alexandria soon afterward between Caesar's forces and supporters of Ptolemy XIII. Fighting spills through crowded streets and harbour districts. Fires burn against the night sky while terrified civilians shelter behind locked doors. Some historians believe parts of the Great Library suffer damage during these conflicts, though their accounts remain uncertain. You walk through smoke-filled streets where soldiers shove barricades into place beside shattered market stalls. The smell of burning wood and seawater fills the air. Somewhere nearby, people scream briefly before silence returns. Great cities become frighteningly fragile during urban warfare. Caesar ultimately secures victory. Ptolemy XIII dies during the conflict, likely drowning while fleeing battle. Cleopatra regains the throne now aligned firmly with Rome's most powerful man, and eventually she bears Caesar a son, Caesarion. For a moment the future seems almost manageable, but Rome destroys stability wherever ambition gathers too densely. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, shock ripples across the Mediterranean world. Cleopatra retreats cautiously to Egypt while Roman factions spiral toward renewed civil war. You sit beside her one night in Alexandria after the news arrives. The palace feels quieter than usual. Sea wind rattles softly against open shutters. She says nothing for a long time, then finally very softly, "They always kill the men who believe themselves eternal." There is no grief performance in her voice, only recognition. Soon another Roman enters her life. Mark Antony. Where Caesar feels disciplined and calculating, Antony arrives emotionally larger. Charismatic, generous, reckless, a brilliant soldier with an appetite for pleasure and dramatic gestures. Together they become politically formidable and personally entangled. You attend a banquet where Antony drinks heavily, while Cleopatra watches him with amused affection across candlelit tables crowded with silver dishes and wine cups. Musicians play louder as the night deepens. Courtiers laugh carefully at Antony's stories. The atmosphere feels warm, dangerously warm, because Rome watches everything. Roman propaganda later transforms Cleopatra into a manipulative Eastern temptress, corrupting noble Roman men. The narrative serves political purposes beautifully. Easier to frame Antony as seduced than politically opposed, reality appears far more complicated. Cleopatra fights relentlessly for Egypt's survival within an impossible geopolitical landscape. Antony seeks power inside Roman struggles already consuming themselves, and somewhere inside all the strategy, genuine attachment likely grows between them. That may be the tragedy, because Octavian Caesar's adopted heir moves patiently and ruthlessly against them both. The final conflict becomes inevitable. At Actium, Antony and Cleopatra's forces suffer catastrophic defeat against Octavian's fleet. Accounts differ regarding exactly what happened during the battle. Confusion, miscommunication, panic, tactical failure. History often collapses through very human mistakes. Afterward, everything unravels quickly. You return to Alexandria beneath oppressive summer heat while fear spreads through the city. Soldiers desert quietly, advisors disappear, rumours multiply hourly. Antony dies first after a failed suicide attempt and false reports of Cleopatra's death. Servants carry his wounded body to her. Blood stains the floor beneath him. Cleopatra holds him while he struggles to breathe. No empire feels present in that room anymore. Only two exhausted human beings losing everything. Soon afterward, facing capture and humiliation in Rome, Cleopatra chooses death herself. The exact method remains debated, poison, aspite, some combination. What matters is the decision. The last ruler of independent Egypt refuses becoming another Roman trophy. You stand outside the silent palace afterward while sea wind moves through Alexandria beneath gathering dusk. Somewhere distant waves strike the harbour wall softly. And with Cleopatra's death, 3,000 years of pharaonic Egypt finally come to an end. The grain ships leave Alexandria before sunrise. You hear them first in the darkness. Ropes creaking against wooden docks. Sailors shouting softly through cool morning mists drifting inland from the Mediterranean. Cargo workers move in steady lines, carrying sacks of wheat toward waiting vessels, while scribes track every shipment by lamplight. The smell is thick and earthy. Grain dust, salt water, sweat. Rome is hungry again. Egypt now belongs to an empire larger than anything the pharaohs ever imagined. After Cleopatra's death, Octavian becomes Augustus' first emperor of Rome, and Egypt transforms from independent kingdom into imperial province. Not an ordinary province, though. A personal possession of the emperor himself. Rome understands Egypt's value perfectly. The Nile Valley feeds enormous populations across the Mediterranean world. Egyptian grain becomes essential to Roman stability. Control the river and you help control the empire. Which means Egypt must remain obedient. You walk through Alexandria beneath the early years of Roman rule, where banners bearing imperial symbols hang beside older temples and Greek colonnades. Soldiers patrol busy streets while merchants continue bargaining exactly as they did before the conquest. That is the strange thing about political transformation. Most ordinary mornings still require bread. The city feels uneasy but functional. Roman officials occupy former royal buildings overlooking the harbour. Tax records multiply, bureaucracy deepens. Latin joins Greek and Egyptian languages already tangled through daily life, and everywhere administration. Empires survive through paperwork almost as much as armies. You spend one humid afternoon inside a Roman tax office where exhausted clerks calculate grain quotas, while farmers wait anxiously in crowded corridors smelling of dust ink and damp wool cloaks. One Egyptian farmer argues bitterly about flood damage reducing his harvest. The Roman official barely looks up. The quota remains, he says flatly. Power often sounds bureaucratic when heard up close. Augustus moves carefully at first. Egypt has a long history of rebellion and cultural pride. Roman rulers allow many local traditions to continue because disruption risks instability. Temples still function, priests still perform rituals, the Nile still floods according to its ancient rhythms. Yet something fundamental has shifted emotionally. The pharaohs are gone. You feel their absence strongly in Upper Egypt, where older temple complexes stand beneath relentless sunlight, their walls still covered in scenes of divine kingship now disconnected from living rulers. At Karnak, priests continue ceremonies before towering columns painted generations earlier, but the confidence behind the rituals feels thinner somehow, like actors continuing a performance after hearing the theatre itself may close. Still, Roman Egypt prospers in many ways. Alexandria remains one of the empire's greatest cities. Trade flourishes across Mediterranean routes linking Egypt with Rome, Greece, Syria, and beyond. Wealthy elites enjoy theatres, bathhouses, libraries, and luxurious villas cooled by sea breezes. You attend a dinner hosted by a wealthy Alexandrian merchant whose household blends Greek education, Egyptian servants, and Roman political connections into one carefully balanced social world. Wine flows freely, while guests debate philosophy and imperial politics beneath painted ceilings. Outside the villa walls, dockworkers sleep beside warehouses after 14-hour labour shifts. Civilization always distributes comfort unevenly. In the countryside, life changes more slowly. Farmers still watch the Nile anxiously each season. Villages still smell of mud-brick livestock and baking bread. Mothers still carry water jars beneath the same brutal sun that shone over pyramid builders thousands of years earlier. Continuity survives conquest remarkably well. Yet Roman taxation weighs heavily. Grain demands increase during difficult years. Corruption spreads through local administration. Some communities resist quietly through evasion, false records, or occasional revolt. You travel south during one poor flood season when anxiety settles visibly across rural Egypt. Cracked earth stretches farther from the riverbanks than usual. Farmers stand silently beside shallow irrigation channels. One old man scoops dry soil through his fingers. Rome still expects full harvests, he says. The river unfortunately ignores imperial policy. Religious life also evolves under Roman rule. Traditional Egyptian gods remain deeply important, especially outside cosmopolitan Alexandria. Temples continue receiving pilgrims seeking healing, fertility, protection, and guidance. But new beliefs move through the empire constantly now. Mystery cults from Greece and Asia Minor, Jewish communities debating scripture and identity, philosophical schools offering alternative visions of meaning. Egypt becomes spiritually crowded. You stand inside the Temple of Isis at Philae while priests chant softly beside flickering lamps reflected across dark river water nearby. The atmosphere feels ancient beyond language itself. And yet Roman tourists wander the complex respectfully marvelling at rituals older than their republic once was. Time overlaps strangely in Egypt. One evening in Alexandria you sit beside a Greek-Egyptian scholar watching ships disappear westward toward Rome beneath a red sunset staining the harbour water dark crimson. Do you think Rome lasts forever, you ask? He laughs quietly. My grandfather asked the same question about the Ptolemies. Then he returns to drinking his wine. There is wisdom in historical perspective. Over generations, more emperors come and go. Some competent, some monstrous, some barely remembered. Egypt remains crucial through all of them because grain matters more than glory. Roman soldiers stationed along the Nile grow old here. Some marry local women. Children speak mixed languages in crowded neighborhoods where Egyptian, Greek, and Roman traditions blur together naturally. Cultures continue mixing beneath imperial systems. At times, the blending feels peaceful, at others deeply tense. In Alexandria, especially ethnic and religious violence erupts periodically between communities competing for status, influence, and protection. Riots leave streets bloodied. Imperial authorities respond harshly. Great cities concentrate human brilliance and resentment together. Meanwhile, the old monuments endure quietly beyond politics. Tourists from Rome visit the pyramids, already ancient tourist attractions by this era. Travellers carve graffiti into temple walls. Guides tell exaggerated stories beneath desert heat. You accompany a Roman senator visiting Giza one cool winter morning. He stares upward at the Great Pyramid in stunned silence, while sand drifts softly across the plateau. "How old is this?" he asks finally. The Egyptian guide smiles faintly. "Old enough," he says. That answer feels perfect, because Egypt now exists partly as memory even while still alive. A civilization transformed into both living province and legendary past simultaneously. And somewhere beyond the cities and temples, beyond Roman administration and grain fleets, another quiet transformation begins spreading through Egypt. Not through armies, not through kings, but through stories whispered about resurrection, salvation, and one God instead of many. The old gods do not disappear suddenly. No dramatic silence falls across the temples overnight. No final priest extinguishes the last sacred flame while thunder rolls above collapsing statues. History rarely grants endings that clean. Instead, the changes arrive quietly. A family stops bringing offerings to a local shrine. A temple loses funding after years of declining visitors. A young man in Alexandria hears a travelling preacher speak about resurrection and carries the story home. The ancient world begins shifting beneath Egypt slowly enough that many people barely notice at first. You walk through Alexandria during the early centuries of Roman Christianity, where crowded streets still overflow with familiar sounds. Merchants shout prices beneath striped awnings. Harbour workers unload grain beside screaming gulls. Incense still burns inside older temples. But new symbols appear now. Simple crosses scratched discreetly onto walls. Small gatherings meeting privately after dark. Whispers about martyrs executed by Roman authorities. The atmosphere feels uncertain rather than triumphant. Christianity enters Egypt through trade routes, urban communities, and personal relationships long before it becomes politically dominant. At first, Christians remain only one religious group among many inside the empire's crowded spiritual landscape. Some Romans distrust them deeply, others barely notice them. You sit inside a modest Alexandrian home one evening, where believers gather around oil lamps, listening to scripture read aloud in Greek. The room smells of bread, olive oil, and warm human bodies pressed close together. No grand architecture, no towering statues, just voices. A woman beside you closes her eyes while prayers rise softly through the room. The emotional tone feels different from traditional Egyptian temple rituals. More intimate, more personal, less tied to sacred geography and inherited ceremony. And yet certain continuities remain unmistakable. Egyptians already understand resurrection stories, divine suffering, eternal life, ritual transformation. The new faith enters a culture deeply familiar with spiritual symbolism. You notice tension growing in Alexandria, especially where theological debates become astonishingly fierce. Bishops argue passionately over doctrine while philosophers challenge Christian teachings in crowded public spaces. At times, the city feels intellectually electric, at others exhausting. One afternoon, you witness a debate spilling into the streets outside a lecture hall where crowds gather beneath harsh sunlight arguing about the nature of Christ's divine authority and salvation. An elderly bookseller shakes his head while listening. People once fought over grain prices, he mutters. Now they fight over heaven. Human beings apparently always find something worth shouting about. Roman persecution of Christians rises and falls across different emperors. Some authorities ignore them entirely, others arrest believers violently during periods of political anxiety. Egypt produces many martyrs whose stories spread through growing Christian communities. You stand outside a prison courtyard after dawn where families wait silently for news about arrested relatives. Dust drifts through pale morning light. Somewhere nearby church bells ring softly beneath the noise of the waking city. Fear hangs heavily in the air, yet persecution often strengthens conviction rather than erasing it. By the 4th century, everything changes again when Emperor Constantine legalizes Christianity across the empire. Suddenly, the once persecuted faith gains imperial protection and influence. The balance shifts rapidly afterward. Temples dedicated to older gods lose political support. Wealth transfers toward churches and monasteries. Public identity changes. Christian leaders gain authority once held by priests of ancient cults, and Egypt transforms spiritually once more. Far from the cities, another movement emerges from the desert itself. The monks. You travel into the Egyptian wilderness east of the Nile, where dry cliffs rise beneath endless white sky, and silence stretches almost painfully between gusts of hot wind. Tiny communities of hermits and ascetics settle here, seeking spiritual purity through isolation. The desert that once symbolized chaos now becomes sacred refuge. You meet an old monk named Apatheon living inside a small stone cell, no larger than a storage room. His possessions fit into one woven basket beside a clay water jar. Sunlight enters through a narrow opening cut into the wall. The air smells of dust and dry reeds. "Why come here?" you ask him quietly. He smiles. "The world is loud." A fair observation. These desert monks influence Christianity profoundly. Their lives of fasting, prayer, labour and contemplation inspire admiration across the empire. Pilgrims travel enormous distances seeking advice from men who deliberately abandoned society. Ironically, fame follows those trying hardest to escape it. Meanwhile, the oldest temples continue fading. Some remain active surprisingly long, especially in southern Egypt. A Pharaoh worship of Isis survives into the 6th century, centuries after Cleopatra's death. You visit the island temple during its final generations of use. Evening light glows softly across carved walls while priests perform rituals inherited through unimaginable stretches of time. The atmosphere feels melancholy, not defeated exactly, but aware. One priest pauses while extinguishing incense beside a statue worn smooth by countless hands. "The gods remember longer than people do," he says quietly. Soon afterward, imperial authorities close the temple officially. Another world ends without ceremony. Some ancient sanctuaries become churches. Others fall slowly into ruin. Sand drifts through abandoned courtyards where hymns once echoed before towering columns painted with stars and sacred animals. And the hieroglyphs, people gradually stop understanding them. That may be the strangest loss of all. The writing system that preserved Egypt across millennia becomes unreadable even to Egyptians themselves. Priestly knowledge disappears generation by generation until the symbols covering temples and tombs turn mysterious. Silent! You walk through Karnak centuries later beside Christian villagers who pass the enormous ruins daily without fully understanding the stories carved across the stone. Children play between fallen columns while goats wander through sacred spaces once feared by kings. Life continues without explanation, and perhaps that is natural. Human beings rarely carry memory forever, yet Egypt never completely forgets itself either. Ancient symbols survive hidden inside folklore, architecture, local customs, and lingering awe toward the monuments along the Nile. The pyramids still rise against the desert horizon. The statues still gaze westward. The river still floods beneath moonlight exactly as it did before the first pharaoh wore a crown. You sit beside the Nile one cool evening, listening to distant church chants drift softly through the darkness while frogs call from nearby reeds. Above you, stars burn across the same sky. Ancient priests once studied beside temple fires. Civilizations change names. Gods gain and lose followers. Empires arrive convinced of permanence, then pass away. But the river keeps moving patiently toward the sea. The sand is patient. That may be the most important thing to understand about Egypt after the pharaohs. Armies come and go, religions rise, divide and transform, cities expand beside the Nile while others disappear entirely. But the desert waits quietly beyond it all, and eventually it covers almost everything. You travel through Egypt during the long centuries after the ancient temples fall silent. Byzantine officials govern from distant imperial systems. Later, Arab armies arrive carrying Islam across North Africa during the 7th century. Arabic gradually joins and then replaces older spoken languages across much of the country. New prayers echo where older hymns once rose. New cities flourish. New rulers claim authority beside the eternal river. And still the monuments remain. You stand before the pyramids at Giza during a cold dawn while camel caravans move slowly across the horizon. Beneath, pale light. Wind pushes fine sand across the plateau in soft whispering waves. The Great Pyramid still towers impossibly above everything, but now it feels disconnected from living memory. Travellers speculate endlessly about who built these structures and why. Stories mutate over generations. Some claim ancient giants raised them. Others insist biblical figures stored treasure there before the flood. Local guides invent explanations freely for curious visitors. The true history fades beneath myth. You walk through abandoned temple complexes where columns cracked by earthquakes lean beneath nests of birds and creeping dunes. Goats wander through courtyards once restricted to priests and kings. Villagers nearby sometimes quarry old stone for newer buildings. Civilizations recycle themselves practically. One afternoon you rest beside a partially buried statue, while workers nearby dismantle ancient masonry blocks for a medieval construction project. Dust hangs thick in the air beneath brutal sunlight. A labourer wipes sweat from his face and glances toward the broken colossus. Old stone is still good stone, he says simply, and from his perspective he's absolutely right. Memory rarely feels sacred to people struggling through ordinary life. Cairo eventually rises near the Nile as one of the Islamic world's great cities. Markets overflow with spices, textiles, books, glass lamps, and human noise. Mosques call the faithful to prayer above crowded streets alive with commerce and conversation. Egypt remains important, but ancient Egypt increasingly becomes something distant, legendary, half understood. You wander through medieval Cairo at sunset, where smoke from cooking fires mingles with perfume and animal dung beneath narrow streets crowded shoulder to shoulder with merchants and travellers. In one coffee house, an old storyteller entertains listeners with tales about buried treasures hidden beneath forgotten tombs guarded by curses and spirits. Everyone leans closer while he speaks, because mystery survives where knowledge disappears. The ancient monuments begin attracting outsiders more frequently over time. European travellers arrive with notebook sketches and romantic imaginations. Some genuinely admire Egypt's past. Others treat the country like a cabinet of curiosities waiting to be emptied. You accompany one Venetian merchant visiting the pyramids during the late medieval period. He circles the structures repeatedly in visible disbelief, while local guides exaggerate measurements and legends enthusiastically around him. How can stone last this long, he asks quietly. No one answers. The question itself feels larger than architecture. As centuries pass, tomb robbers continue probing ancient burial sites, searching for gold statues, jewellery, and magical artefacts. Some excavations resemble organised theft more than archaeology. Mummies are burned for fuel in certain places. Powdered remains even appear in strange medicinal practices abroad. Human beings can be deeply absurd around history, and yet fascination grows alongside destruction. By the 18th century, European interest in Egypt intensifies dramatically. Scholars, adventurers, treasure hunters, diplomats, and opportunists all begin arriving with competing motives. Ancient ruins become objects of obsession for people thousands of miles removed from the civilization itself. You stand beside the Sphinx one windy evening, while foreign travellers sketch its weathered face beneath fading light. Sand buries much of the body now, leaving the head rising eerily from the desert. The expression feels impossible to interpret. Calm perhaps, or exhausted. Then comes Napoleon, not yet emperor, still young, ambitious, brilliant and restless. When he invades Egypt in 1798, soldiers march beside scientists, artists, engineers and scholars, documenting the country obsessively. The invasion itself brings violence and political upheaval certainly, but it also transforms global understanding of ancient Egypt forever. You walk through the French camp outside Cairo where printing presses clatter, beside military tents and scholars argue excitedly over inscriptions copied from temple walls. The air smells of gunpowder, sweat, paper, ink, and horse manure. War and curiosity move together uneasily. One evening, a French artist shows you detailed sketches of hieroglyphs illuminated by candlelight inside his tent. He traces the symbols carefully with ink-stained fingers. It feels like the stones are trying to speak, he murmurs. That instinct proves important. During this period, the Rosetta Stone is discovered near the town of Rashid. At first, few grasp its significance fully. Just another carved fragment among countless ruins scattered across Egypt. But the stone carries the same decree written in 3 scripts, including Greek and hieroglyphs. A key waiting patiently through centuries. Eventually, scholars like Jean-François Champollion decipher hieroglyphs after generations of failure. Suddenly, the silent monuments speak again. Names emerge from stone after nearly 2,000 years of obscurity. Ramesses, Hatshepsut, Thutmose. Ancient Egypt returns to its own history. You imagine the emotional shock of those first successful translations. Scholars staring at temple walls, realizing the symbols are no longer decorative mysteries, but voices. Real voices. Human beings reaching across unimaginable time. Excavations accelerate afterward. Some careful, many destructive. Tombs are opened. Artifacts removed. Museums fill with statues, coffins, jewelry, and mummies transported far from the Nile. Becomes globally famous once more. But fame carries strange consequences. You stand beside a partially excavated tomb at dusk while workers brush sand carefully from painted walls unseen for thousands of years. The air underground smells dry and ancient, almost untouched by time itself. One labourer pauses silently, staring at the colours still vivid beneath his lantern. For a moment, nobody speaks, because sometimes history feels less like discovery and more like awakening something that never fully disappeared. The first thing you notice is the silence. Not complete silence. Egypt never truly becomes silent. Wind still moves softly across desert cliffs. Workers still shuffle through narrow tomb passages carrying lamps and equipment. Somewhere above ground, the Nile continues its ancient journey northward, beneath the birds circling the reeds. But underground, inside the sealed chambers of forgotten kings, the silence feels heavy, almost oppressant. You arrive in the Valley of the Kings during the early 20th century, where archaeologists, labourers, tourists, journalists and treasure seekers crowd the western hills beneath relentless sunlight. Dust clings to boots and camera equipment. Tempers flare easily in the heat. Everyone is searching for something. Gold certainly. Fame too. But beneath those ambitions lies another desire harder to explain. People want ancient Egypt to feel alive again. For generations, explorers have opened tombs only to find them robbed centuries earlier. Broken coffins, scattered bones, empty chambers echoing with disappointment. The valley feels exhausted by intrusion. Then Howard Carter discovers a sealed staircase beneath layers of debris in 1922. You stand beside the excavation site as the workers carefully clear the entrance step by step. Their hands shake slightly despite the routine labour. Sweat darkens linen shirts beneath the afternoon heat. Something about this feels different immediately. Carter peers through a tiny opening into darkness untouched for over 3,000 years. Someone asks whether he can see anything. Yes, he famously replies, "Wonderful things." And suddenly the modern world becomes obsessed. You enter the tomb slowly by lamplight where gold gleams from every direction inside cramped chambers crowded with objects left exactly where ancient mourners placed them. Chariots, thrones, jewellery, linen, food offerings, statues guarding sealed doorways. The air smells dry beyond description. Still, time itself seems preserved here. Tutankhamun, the nearly forgotten boy king, becomes the most famous pharaoh in history, largely because his tomb survives relatively intact. Newspapers across the world print photographs of golden masks and buried treasure. Crowds gather outside museums. Egyptomania spreads through fashion architecture films and popular imagination. A civilization buried beneath sand sits and suddenly feels intimate again. Yet the excitement carries unease too, because opening tombs disturbs something emotionally powerful. You watch Egyptian workers standing quietly beside foreign archaeologists cataloguing treasures beneath electric lamps and camera flashes. One labourer touches a wall painting gently before withdrawing his hand. "My grandfather said the kings still sleep here," he murmurs. Not everyone views excavation as harmless discovery. Then comes the curse. After several individuals connected to the tomb's opening die, unexpectedly newspapers explode with stories about ancient vengeance and supernatural punishment. The death of Lord Carnarvon especially fuels public hysteria. Headlines speak of curses awakening, mummies avenging themselves, ancient powers refusing disturbance. Most historians dismiss these stories logically. Many people involved with the excavation live long lives afterward. Yet emotionally the idea persists because it captures something real. The discomfort of entering the dead person's private world. You stand alone briefly inside a burial chamber after the crowds leave for the evening. Electric lights hum softly against painted walls showing gods guiding Tutankhamun through eternity. Dust hangs suspended in warm air, and for a moment you understand why people speak of curses, not because magic leaps from coffins, but because mortality suddenly feels close enough to touch. Modern archaeology grows increasingly sophisticated over time. Scholars move beyond treasure hunting toward deeper understanding of ordinary life. Religion, medicine, labour, diet, climate, and social complexity in ancient Egypt. New technologies scan mummies without unwrapping them. Satellites identify buried structures beneath sand. Tiny fragments of papyrus reshape entire historical debates. The dead continue speaking unexpectedly. You visit a modern conservation laboratory in Cairo where specialists work carefully beneath bright lights, restoring damaged artifacts recovered from tombs and temples. The room smells faintly of dust chemicals and old linen. One conservator spends hours cleaning pigment from a small funerary object no larger than her hand. People think archaeology is adventure, she says quietly. Then she smiles. Mostly it's patience, a very Egyptian art. How? Meanwhile, tourism transforms the monuments again. Millions arrive yearly carrying cameras, water bottles, exhaustion and awe. The pyramids rise behind traffic and souvenir stalls. Cruise ships drift along the Nile where priests once travelled by torchlight. History becomes industry, and still the old power remains. You stand before Abu Simbel at sunrise, while enormous statues of Ramesses II glow slowly gold beneath emerging light. Tourists speak softly despite themselves. The desert air feels cool and impossibly clear. For a brief moment, nobody checks their phones. Nobody talks loudly. The scale silences everyone equally. Climate, time, and human pressure continue threatening ancient sites constantly. Temples erode, tomb paintings fade, rising groundwater damages foundations built for different environmental conditions thousands of years ago. Preservation becomes a race against time itself, yet Egypt endures astonishingly well considering its age. Perhaps because the civilization understood memory so deeply from the beginning. The Egyptians feared oblivion more than death. They carved names into stone, preserved bodies carefully, filled tombs with stories and objects meant to outlast forgetting, and somehow against impossible odds much of it worked. Tonight, after this long journey, beside the Nile through 3,000 years of kings, labourers, priests, soldiers, queens, scribes, farmers, and forgotten children, you realize ancient Egypt never truly vanished. It simply changed shape. Partly history, partly dream, partly warning. The river still flows beneath moonlight exactly as it did when the first villagers gathered along its banks. Sand still drifts across ruined temples where incense once curled upward into darkness. Human beings still stand before the pyramids struggling to understand why anyone would build something so enormous simply to resist time. Maybe because every civilization secretly hopes to be remembered, and every human being does too. So as the night deepens around us, perhaps you find yourself thinking less about pharaohs and monuments and more about the countless ordinary people hidden between them. The workers carrying limestone beneath brutal sun, the mothers waiting through flood seasons, the scribes staining their fingers with ink beside open windows, the grieving families sealing tombs with trembling hand. History survives because they survived first. And if this journey beside the Nile has stayed with you tonight, I would love to hear where you listened, from what moments lingered most strongly in your mind, and which corners of history you hope we wander through together next time. Until then, may your evening feel peaceful, your thoughts feel lighter, and your rest come easily beneath the same stars that once watched over ancient Egypt. Blessings to you and your family.